She wore a black gown to a celebration dinner and carried a sword anyway, because when you've survived 20 years of battlefields, you learn to read silence louder than screaming. Tonight, the palace was too quiet. The servants moved too fast. The guards looked at walls instead of doorways. Queen Celine Viramont had bled for this kingdom before most of these nobles learned to walk. She'd buried soldiers like sons. She'd held a dying kingdom together with her bare hands while her husband smiled at banquets. And tonight, she was going to find out exactly what kind of man she'd sacrificed all of that for. Stay until the end. Hit like. Drop your city in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from, because this story, it was built for people who refuse to be broken quietly. Part 1. The Night She Stopped Being Silent. The Winter Victory Banquet had been Aldrich's idea. Everything about it was his idea. The imported candles burning white and gold down the length of the Great Hall, the musicians pulled from 3 different provinces, the roasted boar centerpiece that had taken palace cooks 4 full days to prepare. Every detail screamed celebration, and every noble in the kingdom had been summoned to witness it. A show. That was what Aldrich Thornfield did best. He built shows. He dressed them in silk and called them governance. Celine had known this about him for 19 years. She stood at the tall window of her private chamber on the 2nd floor of the West Wing, watching the courtyard below fill with arriving carriages. Torchlight caught the gilded crests of the noble houses: Vale, Morwind, Dunhart, Casterly. Old blood and new money arriving in equal measure. All of them dressed in their finest, all of them coming to toast a king who had announced 3 weeks ago that the winter campaign against the Northern Border Rebellion had been decisively crushed. A great victory. The kingdom was safe. Long live the crown. She had not been consulted about the campaign strategy. She had not been informed of the campaign's conclusion until 2 days after it ended, when a messenger delivered a formal letter. Formal, as though she were a foreign dignitary rather than the woman who had personally designed the assault formation that broke the northern line 17 years ago. The same formation Aldrich's generals had used again this winter. They hadn't credited her in the official announcement either. She'd checked. Her handmaid, Petra, was behind her, threading the last hook of Celine's ceremonial gown. The fabric was black, not mourning black, not widow black, but the deep, deliberate black of a woman who had stopped pretending the color suited her less than gold. She wore black because it didn't show blood. Old habit, one she'd never managed to shake. "The guests are arriving quickly tonight," Petra said. Her voice was careful. Petra was always careful. She had served Celine for 11 years and had learned through small disasters and quiet moments exactly when her queen was in a mood that required gentleness versus one that required silence. Tonight was silence. Celine didn't answer. She was watching the East Wing. The palace was laid out in a shape that the original architects had called a crown, a wide central hall with wings extending outward like points. The West Wing was hers. The East Wing was officially designated as guest quarters for high-ranking visitors, a designation that had been accurate for most of her marriage. Lately, the East Wing had been locked, not guarded in any obvious way, not barricaded, just quietly, consistently locked. The servants assigned to that corridor had been rotated to other duties 3 months ago. She'd noticed. She always noticed. Petra. "My queen. Who cleaned the East Wing corridor last week?" The pause was exactly long enough to confirm what Celine already suspected. I'm not certain. That corridor's maintenance was assigned to Marta's rotation, but I heard Marta was moved to the kitchen staff for the banquet preparation. Who replaced her?" Another pause. Shorter this time. Petra had realized this was not a casual question. "I don't know, my queen. I can find out." "Don't!" Celine turned from the window. The gown fell correctly as she moved. She'd been wearing ceremonial clothing since she was 14, and her body had long since learned how to carry weight that wasn't armor without making it obvious she missed the armor. "I'll find out myself." Petra's hands stilled on the final hook. "Your sword? I'm wearing it. My queen, the banquet." "Petra?" Celine met her eyes in the mirror. There was no anger in her voice, just a flatness that the handmaid recognized, the same flatness that had preceded every difficult thing Celine had ever done. Fasten the last hook. Petra fastened the last hook. The sword was not a ceremonial piece. It was the actual weapon she'd carried through the Dunmore campaign. The siege of Vale, the 3-month nightmare in the eastern marshes that no one in court liked to mention because too many noble sons had died there and the grief was still raw a decade later. The blade had been reground twice, and the grip had been replaced once, but the steel was original. It was the same sword that had killed the Vale warlord in single combat on the steps of his own fortress, ending a war that had claimed 40,000 lives. She wore it now at her hip beneath the fall of black fabric, held by a thin belt that pressed close to her body. You couldn't see it unless you were looking for it. She had never come to one of Aldrich's banquets unarmed. He thought she did it as a personal affectation, a warrior queen's vanity. He'd teased her about it early in their marriage, gently, affectionately, in the way men tease women about things they don't understand. She'd never corrected him. She'd let him believe whatever made him comfortable. It had never been vanity. She descended to the great hall through the servants' corridor rather than the main staircase. She did this because she wanted to observe the room before being observed in it. Another old instinct, the kind that kept you alive when every person in a space had an agenda they weren't announcing. The servants' corridor opened into a small alcove behind the eastern pillar, and from there she could see the full length of the hall without anyone seeing her. The room was already half full. The long tables had been arranged in the traditional formation of victory banquets, a raised head table for the royal family and senior nobility, flanked by 2 long flanking tables descending toward the entrance. Candles everywhere. The boar centerpiece on a carving board at the head table, already drawing admiring comments from nearby nobles. Musicians in the corner playing something bright and martial, all fanfare and no elegance. Aldrich's taste in music ran toward things that sounded like winning. She found him immediately. She always found him immediately in crowds. 19 years of watching his back in throne rooms and on battlefields had made the shape of him automatic to her eyes. He stood at the head table, already holding a cup, already laughing at something Lord Dunhart was saying beside him. He was 51 and still looked 40. A fact that had always seemed vaguely unfair given what 19 years of war had done to her own body. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples in a way that the court declared distinguished. He wore the deep crimson formal jacket that she'd helped him choose at the start of autumn, the one she'd said matched the Thornfield crest correctly. She watched him laugh. She watched the way his shoulders were relaxed, genuinely relaxed, not performed, and thought about what it meant for a man to be genuinely relaxed on a night when his wife had every reason to ask him uncomfortable questions. She stepped out of the alcove and entered the great hall. The room noticed her in stages. Servants first. They always noticed her first. She moved too deliberately not to be tracked by people whose survival depended on reading the room. Then the nobles closest to the entrance, then a ripple outward as recognition moved through clusters of conversation. By the time she reached the first flanking table, the musicians had adjusted their tempo almost imperceptibly. The room had reshuffled its attention, and King Aldrich had turned from Lord Dunhart and was looking at her with an expression she'd spent 19 years cataloging. Tonight's expression was pleased, not surprised. Pleased in a specific, calculated way that looked almost identical to the genuine article unless you knew what you were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. My queen. He extended his hand as she reached the head table, palm up, the formal gesture of spousal greeting in public court. You look magnificent. You say that every time, she said, taking his hand and allowing the formal greeting, and I never believe you. He laughed. The nobles nearby laughed with him. Celine smiled the smile she'd developed for rooms full of people who were laughing at things that weren't funny. Come, sit. He gestured toward the chair at his right. Her position, the queen's position, the seat she'd held for 19 years of banquets. Lord Dunhart was just telling me that the northern border settlements are already beginning reconstruction, faster than projected. Good, she said, sitting. Which engineer did they use? The slight pause in Aldrich's expression was almost nothing, a tenth of a second. Marin's crew, I believe. Marin retired 2 years ago. His son's crew, then. She nodded and lifted her cup. Around them, the table conversation reformed, flowing around and past the royal couple the way water reforms around stones. Celine drank and watched the room. Lord Castor Vale arrived 15 minutes into the banquet, which was late by court standards and precise by political ones. Late enough to make an entrance, early enough not to be a statement. Vale was 54, heavy-set in the way of men who had been soldiers and then stopped being soldiers and kept eating as though they hadn't. With a gray beard he kept close trimmed and eyes that she had always thought were slightly too still for a man who laughed as frequently as he did. He was the head of the Vale house. His father had been the warlord she'd killed. She watched Vale greet the king. It was the greeting that was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not wrong in a way that any of the perfumed nobles around her would have caught. But she had spent enough time in enough throne rooms and enough battle councils watching men negotiate alliances in real time to know what a greeting looked like when both participants already knew its outcome. Vale and Aldrich clasped hands and exchanged words, and there was a fraction of a second where Aldrich's eyes cut right, not toward her, not toward anyone visible, just right, and then back. And Vale's expression shifted from politic to relieved and then back to politic. She filed it. The banquet proceeded. There were toasts. The generals who had run the winter campaign stood and were acknowledged, and she watched their faces when Aldrich praised their strategy and thought about the formation she'd designed 17 years ago that they had run again. She ate. She smiled. She refilled her cup once and did not finish the second pour. She answered questions from Lady Casterly on her left about the wool trade negotiations, and from Lord Morwind on her right about the proposed road tax revision. And she gave both of them accurate, considered answers because she had done her actual job through all of this, the whole time, without anyone asking whether she'd like to stop. It was during the third toast that she heard it. She heard it not with her ears, but with the part of her that had never, in 42 years of living, fully stood down from alert. A shift in the room's social frequency. The way servants at the far end of the hall had adjusted their trajectory without any visible instruction. The way two of Aldrich's personal household guards had quietly changed positions in the last hour, drifting, gradually, naturally looking, from their post near the main entrance toward the corridor that led to the east wing. She set down her cup. "I need a moment," she said quietly to the empty air beside her. The polite fiction of speaking to no one in particular that queens used when they were about to do something they hadn't announced. She rose. Aldrich was in the middle of a story about the Northern Campaign, his voice carrying, his hands moving with the specific theatrical energy he deployed when he wanted an audience's full attention. He did not look at her. She walked toward the back of the hall at the pace of a woman who was going to the retiring room, which was where she was expected to be going, and then she turned left instead of right at the end of the main corridor. The east wing was dark. That was the first thing. The darkness was deliberate, not incidental. The wall sconces along this corridor were unlit, where every other corridor in the palace during a banquet would have been fully illuminated. Someone had extinguished them, or simply not lit them, and believed that the dark would serve as its own instruction to stay away. She moved without touching the wall, following the line of the corridor from memory. She'd walked these halls for 19 years. She knew them better than the people currently trying to hide things in them. She could smell the perfume before she reached the door. It was a specific perfume. Sweet and heavy, with something floral underneath that she'd noticed twice before in the last year. Once at a spring court gathering, she'd attributed to Lady Casterly. Once on the left shoulder of Aldrich's formal jacket when he'd returned late from what he'd described as an extended meeting with the Treasury Council. She stopped in front of the locked door of the East Wing's private residence, the largest and most comfortable of the guest quarters, the one with its own attached bathing room and a south-facing window that caught the winter sun. She listened. Movement. The soft, specific kind that meant someone trying not to be heard. A voice. Low, female, young, saying something she couldn't make out. Then another sound, the metallic whisper of something being moved across a stone surface, a box or a chest being slid. Celine reached up and knocked. 3 knocks. Measured. The knock of someone with authority. The movement behind the door stopped. She waited. Then she reached down, unhooked the sword from its belt, and drove the pommel into the lock. She'd broken locks before. Iron ones, bronze ones, the elaborate layered mechanisms that siege engineers installed on fortified doors believing they could hold against anything. This lock was decorative. It broke on the second strike. She put her shoulder against the door and walked through. The room was lit with several small candles arranged on the window ledge and a single floor lamp in the corner, which gave it a warm and amber quality that the architects had not designed for and which made it look, under any other circumstances, almost comfortable. There was a writing desk against the right wall, covered in papers that someone had clearly begun collecting and was attempting to organize. There was a narrow bed against the left wall with a trunk open at the foot of it. There was a dressing screen in the far corner near the bathing room door. And standing between the writing desk and the window, gripping a sealed leather case against her chest with both hands like it was something she intended to run with, there was a young woman. She was perhaps 22, perhaps less. Dark hair loose around her shoulders, which meant she hadn't been planning to be seen tonight. She wore a silk robe that was fine enough to be a gift rather than a purchase. She was pretty in the specific, unformed way of people who had not yet had anything hard enough happen to them to rearrange their features around it. Her eyes were very wide. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the young woman said, "I was told," and stopped. "You were told what?" Celine said. The young woman's mouth closed. She clutched the leather case tighter. Celine looked at the writing desk, then at the trunk, then at the case in the woman's hands. She was reading the room the way she'd read every room she'd ever had to be dangerous in, cataloging exits, tracking hands, calculating what the presence of a sealed leather case meant to a young woman standing alone in a palace room she had no official reason to occupy. "What's in the case?" Celine said. The young woman stepped back, hit the window ledge, and stopped. "I don't know you. You know exactly who I am." The silence that followed that was its own kind of answer. Celine walked across the room slowly, the sword still in her hand, not raised, not pointed, just present, the way she carried it when she wanted its existence to be part of the conversation without making anyone do anything stupid. She stopped 6 feet from the young woman and held out her left hand. "Give it to me." "I can't. I'm not asking a second time." The young woman's chin lifted. There was something in that gesture, stubborn and frightened simultaneously, that told Celine she'd been coached on how to look unbothered, coached on what to do if she were confronted. The coaching hadn't accounted for this specific scenario, the queen herself walking through a broken lock at night, but the coached reflex had fired anyway. "Lord Aldrich will—" "King," Celine said, and her voice had dropped into a register that she didn't use often. The register she'd developed over 3 campaigns and 1 siege, the voice that carried across battlefields without shouting. "You will use his correct title in my presence." The young woman flinched. The chin came down. The grip on the leather case loosened by a fraction. "What's your name?" Celine said. "Evelyn." A whisper. Then, with slightly more composure, "Lady Evelyn, of the Dunhart house, Dunhart." Lord Dunhart was standing next to Aldrich at the banquet right now, had been standing next to him when she'd entered the great hall, had been laughing at the same story at the same time. She filed it. "How old are you, Evelyn?" 20. "How long have you been in this room?" The young woman hesitated. 3 months. 3 months. The servant's rotation change had happened 3 months ago. She filed it. "Give me the case," Celine said. The young woman looked at her for a long moment, calculating in her own way, probably running the same coached instructions through her head again, probably landing on the same conclusion Celine had already reached, which was that the only way this ended without the case changing hands was if Celine allowed it to. And Celine was not going to allow it. Evelyn held out the case. Celine took it with her left hand, set it on the writing desk without opening it, looked back at the young woman. "Are you being kept here against your will?" Evelyn blinked. That wasn't a question she'd been coached to expect. "No." "Are you afraid of what happens to you if you speak to me honestly?" The blink again, longer this time. Then, "Yes." "That's an honest answer." Selena set the sword flat on the writing desk beside the case. Not put away. Set aside. There was a difference, and she intended the young woman to understand it. "I'm going to ask you things, and I want you to understand that whatever you tell me, I am not your enemy tonight. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Evelyn looked at the sword and then back at her face. "Are you going to hurt me?" "No." "But you might." "I won't." A pause. "I don't harm people who are honest with me. It's a rule I've kept longer than this marriage." Something moved across the young woman's face. Not trust. Not yet. Maybe never. but the beginning of a calculation that was running independent of the coaching, the young woman's own intelligence working underneath the instructions someone else had given her, weighing this specific situation and this specific person and arriving at its own answer. Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed. "He said you were going to be removed," she said. Her voice was quieter now, more real. "Before spring. He said there was going to be a council motion and it was already settled and you'd be—" She stopped. "He said it was taken care of. All of it." Celine did not move. She was very good at not moving. What was taken care of? The vote. The arrangement after. Evelyn looked at her hands. "He told me after spring there would need to be a formal transition for the—" She stopped again, took a breath. "I'm carrying his child." The room was very quiet. Outside, faintly, the banquet music played on. Celine stood still for 4 seconds, which was how long it took for the specific sequence of her own thoughts to complete themselves. She had known this conversation was coming in some form. She had known it without fully knowing it, had felt it in the architecture of the last year's silences and substitutions, had traced its outline in every redirected question, and every night Aldrich had come to her bed without meaning it. Knowing a thing was coming and hearing it stated plainly out loud were not the same experience. She'd learned that on battlefields, too. She picked up the leather case and broke the seal. Letters. A stack of them, perhaps 15, tied with a cord. She untied the cord and looked at the first letter's handwriting. She knew Aldrich's handwriting perfectly. They had exchanged letters across distances for 19 years of campaigns and councils and state business. She would know it anywhere. She read the first letter, then the second. The second was not in Aldrich's handwriting, but she recognized the signature at its bottom. Lord Castor Vale, addressed to Aldrich, dated 7 months ago. The relevant passage, and she was very good at extracting relevant passages quickly, confirmed Vale's commitment to support the council motion, expressed confidence in the plan's timeline, and included a single sentence near the bottom that took her 3 reads to be certain she had parsed correctly, because it referenced, in the careful non-language of men who were writing things they believed they might need to deny, a commitment to support the succession claim of any child born of the current arrangement to the Thornfield line. Succession claim. She put the letter down. "Did he tell you what the child would receive?" Celine said. Evelyn was watching her with the careful attention of someone who had just realized the room's temperature had changed in a way they couldn't fully map. "He told me the child would be provided for, that I would be provided for." "He told you more than that." A long silence. Evelyn looked out the dark window. "He told me the child would be recognized." "Recognized as what?" As heir." There it was. Celine set the letters down on the desk in a neat stack and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the surface. She was thinking, not reacting. She had been in enough situations where the difference between those two things was the difference between surviving and not to know how to impose the one on the other when she needed to. She was thinking about what she had in her hands and what she did not yet have, and what she would need to get, and in what order. She was also thinking about the fact that she had spent 19 years beside this man. She had held his hand at his father's death. She had sat beside him through 3 miscarriages, had held grief that belonged to both of them and some that had only been hers. She had designed the battle strategies that made his reputation. She had stood in rooms full of people who believed women belonged in houses and not in councils, and she had made them listen to her anyway, for his sake as much as her own, because she had believed that what they were doing together was real enough to be worth the cost of all of it. She thought about this formation his generals had used this winter. Her formation. His victory. "Who else knows?" she said. Her voice was level. "I don't know. He told me Lord Vale, Lord Dunhart." A pause. "He told me not to worry about it." She almost laughed. She did not laugh. "When did he last come here?" "Last night, hun." She picked up the sword. "Stay in this room," she said. "Don't send any messages tonight. Don't speak to anyone. If anyone comes to this door besides me, don't open it." Evelyn looked at her. "What are you going to do?" Celine walked to the door, stopped. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm going to think." She walked back out into the dark corridor. The door to the East Wing residence stood open behind her. She'd broken the lock, and there was no point in closing it now. And for a moment she stood in the lightless hall with the sword in her hand, and the faint sound of banquet music reaching her from 3 corridors away, and she let herself feel it, the full weight of it, 19 years of weight stacked on top of this specific night. She let herself feel it not because she was weak, but because she had learned over 42 years of hard living that feelings you didn't allow yourself to feel in the appropriate moment had a habit of appearing later at the absolutely worst possible time, usually when your hands needed to be steady. So she stood in the dark and felt the weight of it for exactly as long as she could afford. Then she began walking. She did not walk toward the Great Hall. She walked toward the back stairs that led to the military wing, the part of the palace that quartered the household guard captains and the ranking officers of the royal knights who were assigned to palace duty. She walked there because she was a woman who had spent her life being useful, and she was not going to stop being useful tonight. She was going to do what she had always done, which was figure out what she had, and figure out what she needed, and figure out the gap between them. She had 15 letters. She had a young woman who might or might not speak the truth under pressure. She had a name, Vielle Dunhart, and a timeline that ended before spring. She did not yet have enough, and she knew it, and she walked faster. The military wing was quieter than the rest of the palace during banquet nights. Most of the officers were in the Great Hall or the kitchens, but Captain Bryn Odell kept different hours than most of the palace's military staff, a habit she'd noticed 2 years ago when she'd walked this corridor at midnight for her own reasons and found his door still lit. Odell was 46, former cavalry, currently commanded the 1st Household Guard Division. He had served under her command in the Eastern Marshes campaign, and she had pulled him from a field ditch personally when a mounted retreat turned into a rout and left half his unit behind. He'd thanked her for that once, formally and briefly, and never mentioned it again, which was exactly the kind of man she needed right now. She knocked on his door, a pause. Then, "Who?" "The Queen." A longer pause. The sound of boots on stone. The door opened. Odell was dressed, but barely. Jacket over undershirt, boots but no belt. The look of a man who had been working late and hadn't decided yet whether he was going to sleep. He had a straight-backed soldier's posture that he maintained even at midnight, and a face that had been battered by enough weather and hard circumstance to look like he'd stopped caring what it looked like. His eyes, gray, direct, absolutely awake, went from her face to the sword in her hand and back. "My queen." He stepped back from the door. She walked in. His office was small and practical. A writing desk, a chair, a weapons rack on the wall with everything hanging in the correct order, a single shelf of papers that were all organized and labeled. She turned to face him. "I need to ask you something directly," she said, "and I need an answer that has nothing in it except the truth." He stood straight. "My queen, if I told you that the king was planning to remove me before spring, that multiple noble houses had already committed to support it, and that there is documentation confirming a succession arrangement that bypasses every established protocol this kingdom runs on, what would you tell me?" Odell looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't move. This was something she'd always respected about him. He didn't perform reactions. He had them slowly and internally where no one could use them against him. "I'd tell you," he said finally, "that there's been talk." "What kind of talk?" "Quiet kind. The kind you hear in corners, and nobody repeats with their name attached." He paused. "There's been movement in the 2nd Division, transfers I wasn't consulted on. 3 men I know personally were reassigned to the East Wing corridor detail 6 weeks ago and then pulled from it without explanation." She kept her face still. "Whose orders?" "The transfers came from the king's household, signed by Lord Aldrich's personal secretary." He said the title with a flatness that told her everything she needed to know about what he thought of it. "I flagged it to my commander. It wasn't addressed." "Your commander is Harwick." "Yes." She filed Harwick. "How many of the 1st Division are yours, actually yours, men who answered to you during the marshes and haven't changed since?" Odell looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man doing an accurate count rather than an optimistic one. 32 in the 1st Division, 14 in the 3rd, they pulled with me from the cavalry. Maybe a dozen in the outer guard who I'd trust to follow my read of a situation if it came to that. 58. Give or take. She set the sword down on his desk. Not to put it aside, she was going to pick it back up. but to free both her hands for a moment. She pressed her palms flat on the desk surface and thought. I need those men to be available to me, she said. Not activated, not mobilized, available. I need them to know, without anyone else knowing that they know, that if I send word through you, they should respond to me rather than to the first instructions that reach them from any other source. Odell was quiet for a moment. That's a significant ask. I know what I'm asking. If this is wrong, I have the letters, Odell. She looked at him directly. I have 15 letters, 2 of which carry Vale's seal, and I have a girl in the East Wing who is carrying the king's child and has been told the child will take the throne. She paused. I don't ask for things I can't back. He was quiet for longer this time. She let him be quiet. She had time for this conversation and not much else, and she was going to spend the time correctly. The marshes, he said finally. Not a question. The marshes, she said. He nodded. A single, brief nod, the kind that meant something had been decided in a place that couldn't be argued with. I'll make contact before dawn. Nothing that can be traced. You'll have an answer before the morning watch changes. I also need to know if there's anyone you trust in the Treasury Division. A pause. What for? Because if this timeline ends before spring and the succession arrangement is already in writing, then there are accounts being prepared that I'm not supposed to see. I want to see them. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite admiration and not quite fear and was, she thought, something in the territory between respect and genuine wariness. The look of someone who was recalibrating the situation they were standing in. Yes, he said. There's a man named Forrest, junior treasury clerk. He served with the Marshes Company as a supply runner. He owes me a debt. Keep that debt for now. I'll tell you when I need to call it. She picked up her sword and walked to the door. Stopped. One more thing, she said, without turning around. If you go to the Great Hall tonight, which I'm not asking you to do, and if you happen to observe the interaction between Lord Castervale and Lord Dunhart and the King during the next 2 hours, and if anything about those interactions strikes you as significant, I'd want to know what you saw. Understood. She walked out. She was back in the main corridor now, the banquet music louder here, filtering through the palace walls with that particular hollow echo of sound moving through stone. She had 58 soldiers she could potentially trust, 15 letters she needed to secure, a young woman who could be a witness or a liability depending on how this developed, and a husband currently raising a cup to his own victory in a room full of people who had already agreed to his next move. She thought about what she'd said to Evelyn. I don't know yet. I'm going to think. She was still thinking. She turned toward the Great Hall. She was going to walk back into that room and sit down at that table and smile at the right moments and refill her cup and say appropriate things to the nobles on her left and right. And she was going to do this for the rest of the banquet without anyone in that room understanding that the person sitting in the Queen's chair was no longer the woman who had walked into it 2 hours ago. The woman who had walked in had been surviving. The woman who was walking back had decided to stop. She was 3 steps from the Great Hall entrance when the side door to her left opened and Lord Castervale stepped through it. He was alone, which was unusual for a man who generally kept at least one aide within arm's reach at formal events. His color was slightly high. He'd been drinking more than is usual, which she clocked immediately because she tracked the drinking patterns of people who might be her enemies the way other people tracked weather. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He stopped. She stopped. They stood in the corridor looking at each other for a moment that was longer than it should have been for 2 people who had no particular reason to be stopped in a corridor. Vale's father had been the warlord she'd killed. She'd known Castervale since he was 28, when he'd arrived at the post-war negotiations as part of the Vale House delegation and shaken her hand with the specific grip of a man who was thinking about what she'd done to his father and making a decision, in real time, about how to carry that. She'd respected the grip. She'd watched him, over the following years, build the Vale House back to relevance through trade and political maneuvering rather than warfare, which told her he was smart enough to know that revenge taken through corridors lasted longer than revenge taken through battlefields. She had always known, somewhere very quiet in the back of her mind, that he would find a moment. She just hadn't known it would look like this. Lord Vale, she said, enjoying the banquet. My queen. His voice was careful. Not guilty. Careful. The distinction was important. A guilty man gave himself away. A careful man gave you nothing except the shape of his caution. A fine evening. Yes, she said. The boar is exceptional. You should have some before it's gone. She walked past him into the great hall. She sat in her chair. She smiled at the right moments. She answered questions from Lord Morwind about the road tax. She ate 2 more bites of the boar, which was in fact exceptional, and thought that someone had done good work with the preparation. She was sitting there, the picture of a queen at ease, when Aldrich leaned toward her and murmured, "I'd like to propose a joint toast. For the victory. The 2 of us together. The court should see us together tonight." She turned to look at him. He was close enough that she could see the candle reflection in his eyes, could smell the wine on his breath, could see the specific quality of his expression that she'd spent 19 years learning to read. What she saw in his expression tonight was not love, was not even warmth, was not even the comfortable familiarity of a long partnership, the kind that outlasts passion and settles into something quieter and more durable. What she saw was the expression of a man who had already made his decision and was now managing the time between that decision and its execution. She smiled at him. "Of course," she said, "a joint toast." She reached for her cup and he reached for his, and they raised them together toward the room's expectant attention. And the court cheered for a king and queen who looked from every angle like a perfect picture of unity. Under the table, her hand had dropped to the hilt of her sword, and in the east wing, 3 corridors away, in a room with a broken lock and a stack of 15 letters sitting on a writing desk, the very young woman named Eveline sat on the edge of a bed with her hands folded over the beginning of a secret that everyone in this room had been keeping. Except now Celine had it too. She drank the toast. She smiled. She lowered her cup. And then, from across the great hall, the main entrance doors swung open. A messenger in road-dirty travel clothes, not a palace messenger, not in palace livery, someone from outside the walls who had ridden hard and been admitted past the outer gates on urgent business, crossed the threshold and walked directly toward the head table without stopping to observe any protocol, which meant his message had been classified as too urgent to wait for protocol, which meant someone had let him through with that classification. He stopped in front of the king. He leaned down and spoke directly into Aldrich's ear. She watched Aldrich's face change. It changed in the way of a man who has received information that was not supposed to arrive tonight, that has arrived ahead of schedule, that has fundamentally altered the order of his planned events. He absorbed the message with his jaw tight and his eyes going briefly and very completely blank, and then he reset his expression in the way of a man who had practiced resetting it, but not fast enough for her. She set down her cup. "What news?" she said, loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, because she was making it his problem to answer her in public or dismiss her in public, and either one told her something. Aldrich looked at her. The reset expression held. "Nothing urgent," he said. "A border matter. I'll address it in the morning." "A border matter that required a night rider to cross the outer gates during a royal banquet," she said. "That sounds urgent." A small silence had fallen over the nearest section of the table. People had noticed. People were watching. Aldrich held her gaze for a long moment, and she held his, and she thought, 19 years. "I know every expression you have, and I have never, in 19 years, seen you look at me like that. Like you're afraid of what I already know." The messenger was still standing there, still holding the folded paper, still waiting for a formal acknowledgement of receipt. Celine looked at the paper, and then she looked up, across the great hall, past the candles and the toast cups and the carving board with the boar and Lord Castor Vale, who was now back in his seat and very carefully not looking in her direction. And she understood, with the specific crystalline clarity of a woman who had spent her whole life walking toward things rather than away from them, that whatever was written on that paper, whatever the messenger had just whispered into her husband's ear on this of all nights, ahead of schedule and without warning, was not the thing she'd found in the East Wing. It was something else, something she didn't have yet, and Aldrich's eyes, still on hers, still holding that expression she had never seen before, and was only now naming correctly, were the eyes of a man who had just realized that his window was closing. The messenger was still standing there. That was the detail that kept pulling at her. Not the paper in his hand, not Aldrich's face, but the simple fact that the man was still standing there in road mud and sweat in the middle of a royal banquet because no one had thought to dismiss him, which meant Aldrich had received the message and forgotten, for a fraction of a second, to manage his surroundings. That fraction was everything. A man who forgot to manage his surroundings was a man who had just been genuinely surprised, and a man who had just been genuinely surprised was a man whose plan had developed a crack. She needed to know what was in that crack before he remembered to seal it. "Dismiss the man," she said. Quiet. Conversational. The tone of a queen making an obvious suggestion rather than issuing a command. Aldrich looked at her for one more beat, then turned to the messenger and made the brief gesture of formal receipt. The messenger bowed, backed 3 steps, turned, and walked out. The doors closed. The nearest section of the table's conversation reformed around a new topic with the practiced social instinct of nobility, who had long since learned that the most dangerous thing you could do at a royal banquet was appear to have noticed something you weren't supposed to notice. Aldrich reached for his cup. "A northern settlement dispute," he said. The reset was complete now, his voice carrying its usual register of comfortable authority. "Apparently it couldn't wait until morning. I'll have Harwick look at it." Harwick. He'd named Harwick without thinking. She filed it again, the same way she'd filed it in Odell's office, and now it meant something different. Not just a name attached to a suspicious transfer order, but a name Aldrich reached for automatically when he needed something handled. "Of course," she said. She ate. She smiled. She sat inside the wreckage of 19 years and said nothing that revealed it, and the banquet moved around her like water around stone, and she spent the remaining 2 hours of the evening doing the most dangerous thing she had ever done in her life, which was wait. Waiting had never been her nature. She had been built by a father who trained her with a soldier's deliberateness and a mother who died too early to soften any of it, for forward motion. She had always moved toward problems. It had saved her life a dozen times in the field and had cost her, over 19 years, more political capital than she could accurately count, because courts ran on patience, and she had always spent hers on battlefields instead. Aldrich had told her once, early in the marriage, gently and with genuine affection, that her greatest flaw was that she couldn't leave a fight alone. She'd taken it as a compliment. He'd meant it as a warning. Tonight, she was going to prove him wrong about the flaw, and she was going to do it in a room full of people who believed they already knew how this ended. The banquet concluded at the 3rd bell. Guests made their departures in the correct order of precedence, each noble house bidding the king good night with the appropriate degree of ceremony. She stood beside Aldrich and smiled and said the right things, and watched Lord Vale take his leave, and Vale met her eyes once during the departure and then looked away, which told her that whatever Aldrich had communicated to him tonight, through the messenger or before it or in the brief corridor exchange she'd observed, had shifted Vale's understanding of the timeline. Something had moved ahead of schedule. She needed to know what. Aldrich walked with her as far as the corridor junction where the west and east wings diverged, which he had not done in 8 months, which meant he was managing her location tonight. "I'll be late," he said. "The border matter." She looked at him. "How late?" "I don't know." "Don't wait up." She studied his face for 3 full seconds, which was longer than social comfort allowed, and shorter than confrontation required. He held her gaze with the specific, practiced ease of a man who had decided that the best way to handle a direct look was to give nothing back. She had seen that decision being made behind his eyes, had watched him choose blankness over the slight defensiveness that had preceded it, and that choice, the speed of it, the deliberateness, told her he'd been practicing this. "Good night, then," she said. She walked to the west wing. She did not go to her chamber. She went to the map room, which was 3 doors past her chamber, and which no one visited at this hour, because the banquet had emptied the administrative staff and the military advisors weren't due back until morning council. The map room held, among other things, the full architectural drawings of the palace, original construction and every renovation since. She had studied these drawings twice, 7 years ago when a minor conspiracy involving 2 kitchen staff and a minor lord had required her to understand every unmonitored access point in the building, and once last year for reasons she had told no one. She found the East Wing architectural drawing and spread it on the table and looked at it in the lamplight. The East Wing's private residence, the room where Eveline was, shared a wall with a storage room that connected to the palace's service corridor network. The service corridors were separate from both the main corridors and the guards' patrol routes. They ran between the walls and connected the kitchen, the laundry, the storage rooms, and the secondary exits. She had used them once during the kitchen conspiracy. No guard rotation covered them specifically because they weren't considered entry points. They were too narrow for armed men in formation. She was not an armed man in formation. She traced the route with her finger. Service corridor access from the West Wing storage room, north past the kitchens, East Junction, then south along the wall shared with the East Wing. The storage room connecting to Evelyn's room was accessible from that route. 20 minutes in complete concealment if she moved correctly. She needed Odell's information first. She needed to know what the messenger had brought before she decided what to do with it. She left the map room and went to her chamber long enough to change from the ceremonial gown into riding clothes. Plain, dark, nothing that caught light. She left the sword in the chamber and took instead the short blade she kept strapped inside the wardrobe, a weapon she'd owned since before she was queen and which fit under a riding jacket without printing against the fabric. The weight of it was different from the sword, more immediate. It said something different about what you were prepared for. She found Odell's second man, a sergeant named Cray, at the service entrance of the military wing at the time and in the location that Odell's note, slid under her chamber door while she'd been in the map room, delivered by a method she hadn't tracked and didn't need to, had specified. Cray was a lean, quiet man in his 30s who had the economy of movement that came from years of working in spaces where visible activity attracted attention. He handed her a folded paper without speaking. She read it by the narrow lamplight of the service corridor. The messenger had come from the estate of Lord Dunhart, not from the northern border. From Dunhart's estate, 2 hours' hard ride from the capital, which meant he'd left in the late afternoon and arrived exactly when he had. The contents of the message were not confirmed, but Cray had spoken to a palace gate guard who had processed the messenger's entry, and the guard had noted the origin stamp on the rider's authorization pass. Dunhart Estate. Urgent. She folded the paper and held it for a moment. Dunhart. Evelyn's house. The young woman was of the Dunhart line, which meant Dunhart had a direct stake in the succession arrangement. And Dunhart had sent an urgent message tonight, ahead of schedule, during the banquet, in a way that had broken Aldrich's composure for 3 seconds in front of her. Something at Dunhart had changed, something that moved the schedule. "Tell Odell I need the Treasury contact tonight," she said quietly. Cray nodded once and moved away down the corridor without a sound. She stood for a moment in the narrow dark and breathed. The thing about being drawn into a corner, she had learned this not from any teacher, but from the specific repeated experience of actually being cornered, in the field and in rooms, was that it had a feeling she recognized now as useful. Her body had adapted to it over time, had learned to interpret the adrenaline not as panic, but as information. Her pulse was elevated. Her hands were very steady. She was not afraid. She was focused in the way of something that had been given a specific direction to move in, and was now only concerned with the moving. She took the service corridor route to the East Wing. The storage room access was exactly where the architectural drawing had indicated. The storage room itself was full of the particular clutter of a space that got used practically but never prioritized. Old furniture, linens in cedar chests, the kind of accumulation that palaces generated over decades and no one ever decisively addressed. She moved through it without touching anything and found the interior door on the far wall. It was not locked. She opened it carefully and looked into Evelyn's room. The girl was awake. She was sitting at the writing desk. Celine's letters spread in front of her, the cord Celine had cut lying beside them, with a candle lit close to her left hand, and she was reading. Her face in the candlelight was concentrated and young, and gave Celine for one unwelcome second a feeling she didn't want and set aside immediately. Evelyn looked up. Her whole body tightened. "It's me," Celine said, stepping through. The tension didn't leave. It recalibrated. "You came through the wall." The service corridor. Celine crossed the room and stood at the edge of the lamplight, looking at the letters spread on the desk. "What are you looking for?" Evelyn looked at the papers and then back at her. The date on Vale's letter, the second one. I needed to remember it correctly. She had read both letters. She'd understood what she'd read. And 7 months ago he committed to the council motion, but the other letter, Evelyn touched the third letter in the stack, the one Celine hadn't reached before she'd pocketed the case. "I didn't know about this one until tonight. I didn't know he'd written it." Celine picked up the third letter. It was short. 4 lines. The handwriting was Aldrich's. The addressee was Lord Dunhart. The content was a confirmation of a date, and not spring, as Evelyn had been told, but earlier, much earlier. The Grand Council gathering was in 6 weeks. He told you spring, Celine said. He told me after the spring thaw, after the northern roads were passable. Evelyn's voice was flat in a way that had not been there earlier in the evening. She'd been sitting alone with these letters for 2 hours. Something in her had settled into a different quality of understanding. He lied to me. Celine set the letter down. The council gathering, Evelyn said. That's when he's doing it. That's when he announces... She stopped. He was going to announce it while I was showing, so no one could deny it. He'd have the council committed before the announcement. Then I'd walk in and it would be... She made a small, precise gesture with her hand. Done. Settled. And you'd be what? Celine said. Evelyn looked at her. After the child was announced as heir, Celine said. What had he told you you'd be? A long silence. The candle between them moved slightly in air from some draft in the old walls. He told me I'd be acknowledged. Her voice was very careful. He said there would be a formal title. What title? He didn't specify. She looked at the young woman for a moment. Then she pulled the chair from against the wall and sat down across from her, which she hadn't done earlier because earlier she hadn't decided yet whether Evelyn was a liability or an asset. She had decided now. He was going to exile me before the council gathering, Celine said. Strip my title at the council. Then present the succession arrangement. Which means by the time your child's claim was announced, I would already be gone. The council would already be committed, and whatever title he'd promised you would be whatever he decided to give you after there was no longer anyone with more authority than him left in the room. She paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Evelyn's jaw was tight. Yes. He was going to use you to move me out and then put you wherever suited him. The child is the instrument. You're the container for the instrument. The girl's eyes went sharp at that. Good. Sharp was something Celine could use. What do you want? Evelyn said. I want the letters. All of them. Including any I haven't seen. Evelyn reached under the desk and pulled out a second leather case, smaller than the first. She set it on the desk surface. There are 9 more. He brought them himself. 2 months ago. He said they were for safekeeping. For safekeeping. She almost laughed again. He'd stored his own evidence with the person who had the least official power to use it against him. It was either the most confident move she'd ever seen from him or the most careless. After 19 years, she still wasn't entirely sure those were different things when it came to Aldrich. She opened the case and read each letter. It took 12 minutes. She was a fast reader and she was reading for specifics, names, dates, commitments, the particular language men used when they were writing things they believed could be denied. By the end, she had a complete picture of a conspiracy that had been running in its earliest form for nearly 2 years. Vale's involvement was oldest. Dunhart had joined 14 months ago. 2 other names appeared, Lord Fenwick of the Eastern Provinces and a man named Strand who held a treasury appointment she recognized as relatively senior. Strand Treasury. She put the letters back into both cases and closed them. I need you to do something, she said. Evelyn looked at her without speaking. I need you to stay exactly where you are, say nothing to anyone, and when Aldrich comes to this room, tonight or tomorrow, I need you to behave exactly as you would have before this conversation happened. You want me to lie to him. I want you to not volunteer information. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Celine stood. One of them keeps you safe, and the other one doesn't. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, then... Why does it matter to you if I'm safe? I'm the reason. You're 20 years old, Celine said, and you're going to have a child in this palace with no formal title and no protection once the arrangement served its purpose. Whatever I think about how that happened, the child is real, and you are real, and he was going to manage both of you the same way he managed everything that stopped being useful to him. She picked up both letter cases. That matters to me. Evelyn looked at her with an expression that Celine couldn't fully read, which was unusual. She could generally read people, had built that skill across 42 years of navigating rooms full of them. There was something in the young woman's face that was not gratitude and not suspicion and not calculation, something that was trying to settle into a category it hadn't encountered before. He talks about you, Evelyn said, quietly. Celine stilled. He talks about what you used to be like. When you were in the field, he says... The girl stopped. started again. He says you were the most dangerous person he ever stood next to. He says that's why things changed. Because he stopped being able to stand next to you without, I don't need to hear this. I know. Evelyn looked at the desk. I just thought you should know that he's afraid of you. Not of what you might do, of what you are. He's been afraid of it for a long time. The corridor outside was completely silent. Celine stood for one moment with that information, held it, felt its weight, and then set it aside in the specific internal location where she put things that were true and painful and not currently actionable. She'd retrieve it later. Not now. Stay in this room, she said. She crossed back to the storage room door, stopped without turning. The child's health. Everything well. A pause. Yes. She walked back through the storage room and into the service corridor and pulled the door closed behind her. The palace was quiet now. The banquet had fully ended, the guests dispersed to their chambers or their carriages, the servants beginning the long process of returning the great hall to its normal state. She moved through the service corridor with the letter cases under her arm, and her pulse at a pace that felt like readiness. Not anger, not grief. Readiness. The state she'd spent most of her adult life living inside. The state that turned out to be more fundamental to who she was than anything she'd believed the marriage had made her. She was 2 corridors from the West Wing when she heard voices. She stopped. 2 men. The service corridor ran adjacent to the main military corridor here, separated by a single stone wall, and sound carried through old palace walls with an accuracy that had surprised her the first time she'd discovered it. She recognized neither voice immediately, but she recognized the register, the low, deliberate tone of men who believed they were unheard and were discussing something they needed to decide before morning. She pressed close to the wall and listened. Can't wait for the gathering. Not after tonight. The first voice. Older. Controlled. He won't move faster. The council votes need... The second voice cut off. The council votes are already committed. Fenwick confirmed this afternoon. It's done. The question is whether she knows. A pause. Long enough that she counted it. She left the banquet twice, the second voice said. Odell's division was flagged twice in the last hour for... Odell. A single word from the first voice, and the flatness of it told her that Odell's name meant something to the man saying it, meant a problem already identified and not yet resolved. If she's already talking to Odell, then we don't have 6 weeks. Silence. How long? The second voice said. Days. Maybe less if she moved on it tonight. The first voice paused. Wake Harwick. Tell him we need the 2nd Division's watch reassigned before the morning bell. Her hand went to the short blade at her side and stopped there. 2 armed men in a stone corridor, no room to confirm who they were before they heard her, no way to exit the service passage ahead of her without crossing their position at the next junction. She was carrying evidence she could not afford to lose in a confrontation whose terms she hadn't set. She went still, completely still, the kind of stillness that was not passivity, but its opposite. The gathered, deliberate motionlessness of something that was choosing in real time between several bad options and selecting the least bad with absolute precision. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Her breathing was shallow and controlled. The footsteps moved away, north toward the main corridor. She heard a door and then silence. She stood in the dark service passage for 11 seconds. Then she turned and went back the way she'd come, moving faster now. The letter cases pressed against her ribs, her mind running the sequence of the next 6 hours with the systematic clarity that had always been her best and most useful quality, the thing she'd built her entire life on, the thing that Aldrich had once called dangerous and that she had spent 19 years trying to moderate, and was now, in the dark of a palace that was already moving against her, entirely done moderating. Days, maybe less. She needed Odell tonight. She needed the Treasury contact tonight. She needed the letters secure and copied and distributed to people who couldn't all be reached at once, so that the destruction of one location didn't end the evidence. She needed to know who the 2 voices belonged to, which meant she needed Cray's eyes on the military corridor for the next hour. She needed Harwick accounted for before the 2nd Division watch was reassigned. She was running the list and the corridor simultaneously when the service passage door ahead of her opened. She had the blade out before the light registered. Petra stood in the doorway with a small lamp and an expression of absolute composure that meant she had been standing there long enough to decide on the composure before Celine arrived. They looked at each other. "How long?" Celine said. "Long enough." Petra's voice was level. "Cray told me where you were. I didn't want to wait." Celine lowered the blade. "Why?" "Because Lord Harwick came to your chamber an hour ago. He said he had a message from the king." Petra paused. "I told him you were sleeping. He said he'd wait." Another pause. "He's waiting." The corridor went very quiet around them. Harwick in her chamber. The same Harwick whose name Aldrich had reached for automatically at the banquet table. The same Harwick whose name had appeared in Odell's account of the suspicious division transfers. The same Harwick who, if the voice in the service passage was right, was being woken right now and given instructions about the morning watch reassignment. Harwick was already in her wing. She looked at Petra. "Does he know where I actually was?" "No." "How certain are you?" "He was alone. He didn't check the map room or the service corridor. He checked the retiring room and the sitting room and then stood in your chamber doorway, and I told him you were asleep in the inner room, and he didn't go past me." Didn't go past her. Celine looked at the woman who had been her handmaid for 11 years. Had been, she realized now, her eyes and her gatekeeper and her early warning system for 11 years, quietly and without ever once making it a transaction. "When this is over," Celine said. "It isn't over yet." Petra lifted the lamp. "What do you want to do about Harwick?" She thought for exactly 2 seconds. She was going to walk back into her chamber. She was going to be the queen receiving a late message from her husband, slightly inconvenienced. Nothing alarming in her posture or her face. She was going to listen to whatever Harwick said and give him nothing useful in return and dismiss him in a way that let him report back that she was uninformed and unmoving and exactly where Aldrich expected her to be. And then, before the morning bell, before the watch was reassigned, before whatever window was already closing shut entirely, she was going to call in every debt that 19 years of bleeding for this kingdom had earned her. She handed Petra the letter cases. "Get these to Odell, tonight. Tell him to copy the 3 most critical and distribute to separate locations before dawn." Petra took the cases. "And Petra." She straightened her jacket, set her face. "When we walk back into that room, I'm a woman who spent her evening at a banquet and went to bed like everyone expected." "I know," Petra said simply. They walked. The chamber door was open. Harwick stood inside it, tall, formal even at this hour, with the specific quality of stillness that men carried when they'd been soldiers and had learned to be patient about waiting. He was 50, gray-haired, with the deep-set eyes of a man who had spent years in command and had grown accustomed to having his read of rooms go unchallenged. He looked at her when she entered. She looked back at him without shifting anything in her expression. "Lord Harwick." Her voice carried the precise degree of mild irritation appropriate for a queen interrupted late at night. "This couldn't keep until morning. The king asked me to deliver it personally." Harwick held out a sealed letter. "Tonight." She crossed the room and took the letter, broke the seal, read it. It was brief. Aldrich's handwriting. 3 sentences confirming that due to the urgency of the border situation, he would be occupying the War Council chamber through the night, and she should not expect him. The language was formal and correct, and contained nothing she could call evidence of anything. It also told her exactly what she needed to know. He was positioning himself in the War Council chamber tonight. The War Council chamber had its own guard rotation, its own entrance, and direct access to the room where the seal of royal command was kept. The seal required to authorize emergency council sessions, guard division commands, and the movement of treasury assets. He wasn't sleeping. He was moving. She folded the letter and looked at Harwick. "Thank you," she said. "Tell the king I received it." Harwick watched her for a moment. She met his gaze with absolute neutrality and waited for him to decide that there was nothing here to read. He bowed. He left. She stood in her chamber with the folded letter in her hand and the sound of the door closing behind Harwick and the absolute certainty settling through her like cold water that the 6 weeks she'd thought she had was a number that no longer existed. Tomorrow. Possibly tonight. She turned to the window. The city below was dark and quiet, the winter streets empty at this hour, nothing moving except the distant torches of the outer gate watch. The kingdom that she had bled to protect and build and hold together spread out there below her in the dark, entirely unaware of what was happening inside the walls of the palace that was supposed to govern it. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass. She thought about the marshes, about the moment when the retreat turned into a rout and the formation broke, and there were men dying in the mud, and every instinct said, "Go back, fall back, find the safe ground." And she had turned forward instead, not because she had been unafraid, because she had understood, in the specific way that a person only understood things when they were standing directly inside the worst version of a moment, that the safe ground was already gone, and forward was the only direction left. She took her hand off the glass. She turned back to the room and began to move. She was done waiting. And in the War Council chamber, 3 corridors and a world away, Aldrich Thornfield pressed the royal seal to a document that bore, at the top, the official language of an emergency motion before the Grand Council, dated not in 6 weeks, not in spring, but in 3 days' time, and believed, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never seen the woman he underestimated coming, that he was already done. She moved through this west wing with the short blade at her side and the letter in her hand and the specific focused silence of someone who had stopped performing calm and was now simply operating inside it. The first thing she needed was Odell's confirmation that the letters had transferred. The second thing was Cray's report on the 2 voices in the service corridor. The third thing, and this was the one that required the most precision, the most control over the sequence of her own actions, was to reach the Treasury Clerk Forrest before Harwick's watch reassignment locked down the administrative staff's movement through the palace. She had perhaps 3 hours before the morning bell. She turned into the secondary corridor that ran behind the military wing and found Cray exactly where she expected him, standing in the shadow of the support pillar with the stillness of a man who had learned patience from the ground up rather than from any instruction. "The letters," she said, "with Odell. He's copying now." Cray's voice was low and without inflection. 3 copies, 4 locations. He'll have it done before the 4th bell. The voices in the service passage. "Did you identify them?" A pause. Not a hesitation. A pause. The kind that meant the answer was real, and the man was choosing the accurate words for it. "Lord Strand, Treasury appointment. The second man was Captain Reeve of the 2nd Division." Strand. He was already on her list from the letters. Reeve she knew. 2nd Division, mid-rank, ambitious in the specific way of men who believed their ability had been chronically undervalued and were therefore available to whoever offered them the correction. She had flagged him 18 months ago in a routine officer review and noted the ambition and recommended a closer watch, and the recommendation had gone to Harwick and had apparently gone nowhere further. It landed differently now. "Reeve is moving the 2nd Division watch," she said. "Already moving. 2 posts reassigned in the last hour." Cray looked at her directly. "The East Wing corridor. Both posts are now 2nd Division." She absorbed this. The East Wing corridor. Eveline's room. He was securing the asset before the morning, before anything she might do could reach it. "Forrest," she said, "the Treasury Clerk. He's in the East Staff Quarters. 3rd floor, East End." Another pause. "The East End is inside the reassigned watch zone." She looked at Cray. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who had laid out a problem and was waiting to see how the person in charge of it was going to decide to move through it. She thought for 7 seconds. She counted them. "Get me to the 3rd floor without going through the main East corridor," she said. "There's a way. It's tight." "How tight?" "Maintenance access, single file. Some of it is on your hands and knees." She had crawled through worse in the eastern marshes, with a blade between her teeth and rain coming down sideways. "Show me." Cray moved and she followed him into the narrow space behind the wall that the palace's original builders had intended for ventilation and pipe access, and which had since been used, as far as she knew, only for the occasional emergency repair. It was tighter than the service corridor, low-ceilinged, stone-floored, smelling of dust and cold iron. She kept close behind Cray's shape in the dark, and counted the turns the way she'd been trained to count them, building the route backward in her head so she could reverse it alone if she needed to. They came up through a floor access panel in a supply closet on the 3rd floor of the East Staff Quarters. She brushed the dust off her jacket, and Cray opened the closet door an inch and looked and then opened it fully. "Second door on the left," he said quietly. "The one with the blue cord on the handle." Odell's marker. She crossed the corridor in 4 steps and knocked softly on the door with the blue cord. A long pause. Then the specific shuffle of a man waking from the surface of sleep rather than its depth. Someone who had not fully committed to sleeping because part of him had been waiting for exactly this. The door opened. Forrest was perhaps 35, slight in the way of men who worked with papers rather than their bodies, with the close, focused eyes of someone who spent most of his days reading numbers in poor light. He was in his sleeping clothes. He looked at her face and then past her at the empty corridor and then back at her face, and his expression went through several states very quickly and settled. Finally, on a careful blankness that she recognized as the specific intelligence of a man who understood that what was happening in front of him was significant and was choosing not to react to it until he understood it more fully. Smart. She needed smart. "You served with the Marshes Company," she said. "Supply runner, 3rd year of the campaign." His voice was very quiet. "Then you know what I'm going to ask you." He looked at her for a moment. "I know what Odell told me you might ask." And another moment. He was deciding. She watched him decide, watched the calculation move behind his eyes, the weighing of what he owed against what it cost against what happened if he chose wrong. This was the moment with every person you needed that mattered more than everything that came after it. The moment when they chose freely, before fear or circumstances narrowed the choice down to something smaller. "There's been a Treasury movement," he said. "Started 4 days ago, quiet. Structured to look like routine pre-council preparation." He paused. "It isn't." "What is it?" "Transfer of liquid assets to 3 external accounts. The authorization chain doesn't go through the standard Royal Council review." He held her gaze steadily. "It goes through a single emergency authorization. 1 seal, 1 signature." "Whose seal?" "The royal seal, his signature." He paused again. "And Lord Strand's counter-signature on the routing documents." She felt it. The specific sensation of pieces arriving at their correct positions. The full architecture of a thing becoming visible all at once. The assets were being moved before the council gathering, before the motion, before she could contest anything through official process. If the liquid assets were already transferred and the council motion was already committed and the emergency session was already called, by the time any of it was visible to the people it was supposed to affect, it would already be completed. Not a conspiracy, an execution. "How much?" she said. He told her. She kept her face still. It was enough to run a kingdom for 4 years. It was enough to rebuild the northern settlements 20 times over. It was enough that whoever held it held leverage over every noble house in the kingdom simultaneously, because every noble house had interests that amount of liquid capital could either support or destroy. "When does it complete?" she said. "The final routing is scheduled for the morning authorization window. 6 bells. She looked at the narrow window at the end of the corridor. The sky was still fully dark. She had perhaps 2 hours. "I need you to document what you know," she said. "Everything. The account numbers, the routing chain, the authorization trail. Written and signed. Tonight." Forrest looked at her steadily. "If I do that, I know what it means for you." "Do you?" "I know exactly what it means for you," she said, "and I'm asking you to do it anyway." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll need my papers." She stood in the doorway while he moved to the writing desk in the corner of the small room and began to pull papers from the lower drawer with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew exactly where everything was. She watched the corridor behind her and thought about the sequence of the next 2 hours and ran it forward the way she'd run battle plans forward, looking for the place where it broke, finding the weakness before the weakness found her. The weakness was time. Everything else she had. The time was the thing that was running out from under her feet while she stood here, and there was no way to make it move differently. Forrest wrote for 20 minutes. She did not rush him. At the end, he held out 3 pages, close-written, precise, with the specific formatting of official Treasury documentation that meant it was verifiable and cross-referenceable and not dismissible as a personal account. He signed the bottom of each page and looked at her. "If this works," he said, "I'd like to still have a position in the new arrangement." She took the pages. "If this works," she said, "there'll be a position." She left the room. Cray was in the corridor. She handed him the pages without a word, and he folded them into his jacket. They moved back toward the access panel and down through the maintenance passage, and she counted the turns in reverse the way she'd planned and came out through the supply closet into the service corridor with the cold stone smell of the hidden parts of the palace around her and the fourth bell sounding somewhere above. 2 hours. She was moving back toward the west wing when she heard Petra's step behind her. She knew Petra's step the way she knew her own, had learned it across 11 years of shared chambers and corridors, and the particular rhythm of a woman who moved with purpose, but not aggression. And she turned. Petra was not alone. The man standing beside her was Odell, which was not what she'd expected. She'd expected Cray to be the contact point, had planned the next hour around Odell staying with the copied letters until they were distributed. He was standing in the service corridor with his jacket half buttoned and his face carrying the specific expression she had never, in 6 years of working with him, seen on it before. She had seen him in the marshes with an arrow through his forearm, continuing to command his unit. She had seen him in the winter campaign's aftermath when 3 of his men hadn't come back, standing over their names on the casualty record with his jaw set and his hands at his sides. She had never seen him look like this. "What happened?" she said. "Moreland," he said. The name landed in her chest like something physical. Moreland. Captain Jess Moreland. 1st Division, 15-year veteran. The man she'd personally recommended for his current rank 4 years ago. The man who had fought beside her through 2 campaigns and who she had counted with certainty, had not even questioned, among the 58. "What did he do?" she said. Her voice was flat. "He went to Harwick." Odell's voice was controlled, but the control was the kind that cost something. "An hour ago. He reported the contact I made tonight, the letter distribution." A pause. All of it. She stood very still. She was thinking about Moreland's face, the specific, weathered, reliable face of a man she'd trusted with her back in the field and with her confidence in this palace and with the first information she'd moved tonight, the information that had been the foundation of everything else she'd built in the last 6 hours. She was thinking about the moment when she'd decided to trust him, had walked the decision through her own judgment and come out the other side certain. She had been certain. This was the thing she had to hold still while she absorbed. Not the operational damage. She could assess that, could run the numbers, could work out what Harwick now knew and what he didn't, and where the gap between those 2 things left her. That was a solvable problem. The problem underneath it was not solvable the same way. The problem underneath it was the specific sensation of having been wrong about a person you'd built certainty around, and the way that wrongness didn't just change the present situation, but reached backward and rewrote everything you'd read in the past as something different. She had pulled Moreland from a field ditch in the marshes. She had held his report of dead soldiers with her own hands and sat with him while he processed it. She had recommended his rank because she'd believed his character warranted it, and had not asked anyone else's opinion because she'd trusted her own. And he had walked to Harwick. She breathed. "How much does Harwick know?" she said. "The letter distribution, the contact with Forrest." Odell paused. "He doesn't know the content of what Forrest gave you. Moreland didn't know that." "Does he know where I am?" "Not yet, but he'll have the service corridors covered by the 5th bell." She looked at Odell. "How many of the 58 are still intact?" 43. "I've already pulled the contact from the 12 I can't verify. There are 3 others I'm not certain about. 43 from 58. She ran the math. It was not enough for a direct confrontation. Not against a full 2nd Division reassignment with Harwick commanding it. Not in a palace where the physical layout favored the side that had already moved its pieces into position. It was enough for something different, something more precise. "The Grand Council session," she said. "The emergency motion. He's called it for 3 days' time." "Yes. Is there a mechanism to contest the calling of an emergency session?" Odell looked at her for a moment. "Not through the military. Through the council itself. Is there a mechanism? You'd need 3 senior council members to formally contest the emergency designation before the session opens." He paused. "If the 3 houses submitting the contest have clean standing, no outstanding disputes, no pending royal claims against them, the session has to be suspended for a standard review period of 14 days. 14 days? Against 3. "Which houses?" she said. "Moorwind, Casterly, and—" He stopped. "Dunhart is compromised. Vale is compromised. Fenwick is already committed on Aldrich's side." He looked at her with the honest directness that had always been his most useful quality. You'd need a third house with clean standing. The only one I can think of is Braith. Braith. Lord Aldous Braith, Eastern Province, 70 years old, had served on the Royal Council for longer than any current member. He had been largely silent in court proceedings for the last 3 years, which the court had interpreted as age-related withdrawal and which she had always suspected was something more deliberate. She had spoken to him directly perhaps a dozen times in 19 years, always briefly, always in formal settings. She did not know where he stood. "Get me to Morwen," she said. "Now, before the 5th bell." She turned to Petra. "The letter cases. Where?" "Odell's second location, already moved. There are 3 pages from Forrest in Cray's jacket. They go to the same location. Tell Cray." Petra moved without acknowledging the instruction. The practiced efficiency of a woman who had been operating as a silent extension of someone else's intelligence for 11 years, and had learned that acknowledgement took time. That movement didn't. She followed Odell. Lord Morwen's palace chambers were in the central wing, neutral ground, technically, belonging to neither the royal family nor the East Wing's current politics. She had spoken to Morwen at the banquet table that very night, had answered his question about the road tax with genuine information, had watched him receive it with the attentiveness of a man who took governance seriously. He was 62, widowed, had 2 sons in the provincial administration. He had no outstanding disputes with the crown. He also had, she knew from a conversation 2 years ago that she had filed and never expected to use, a specific and pointed view about the legitimacy of succession arrangements that bypassed established protocol. He'd expressed it in the abstract. At the time, she'd agreed with him abstractly and moved on. Odell knocked on his door. A longer wait than Forrest. A man of Morwen's age and station slept more deeply and required more of the world to intrude before it reached him. Then the door opened and a young manservant looked out, and Celine said, quietly and without inflection, "Tell Lord Morwen the Queen is at his door and needs 5 minutes of his time." The door closed. Another wait. Then it opened again, wider this time, and the manservant stepped aside, and Morwen stood in his dressing gown with the lamp in his hand and the look of a man who had been awake for perhaps 30 seconds and was already processing the situation with the speed of someone who had spent 40 years in rooms where information required fast assessment. He looked at her face, then at Odell behind her, then back at her face. "Come in," he said. She told him what she needed in 4 sentences. He listened to all 4 without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. Men who interrupted were men who were reacting. Men who listened to the end were men who were thinking. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Casterly," he said finally. "Lady Casterly will contest. She's been uncomfortable with Vial's influence on the council for 2 years. She's mentioned it to me privately twice." And a third. "Braith," he said, which was exactly what she'd thought, which told her that the calculation was not hers alone. "I can send a man to Braith's chambers tonight. He's a light sleeper. He'll hear it." "It has to be before the 5th bell," she said. "After that, the watch reassignment locks down the central wing's corridor access. I understand what it has to be before." He said it without impatience, in the tone of a man who was simply clarifying that the urgency had been received. He looked at her steadily. "If this works, if we get the suspension, 14 days is not a resolution. It's a delay." "I know. You'll need the full council, not 3 houses. You'll need what those letters prove to be presented in open session with witnesses who can speak to the documentation chain." "I know. And Aldrich will not wait 14 days without moving." "I know that too." She held his gaze. "I'm asking for 14 days to make what I have into what I need. That's all." He looked at her for a long moment. She held herself still under the look, not because it made her comfortable, but because she understood what he was doing, which was looking at the person asking him to take a significant risk and deciding whether the person warranted the risk. She had made the same calculation about people herself more times than she could count. She knew how it felt from both sides. "My family's seat," he said, "has been in this kingdom for 6 generations. My father served your father-in-law's court. My sons will inherit what I leave them." He paused. "I did not fight through 6 decades of this kingdom's politics to watch a succession arrangement written in secret by 3 conspiring houses rewrite what a crown is supposed to mean." He turned and spoke to the manservant. The manservant left at a pace that wasn't quite a run. She walked back into the corridor. Odell fell in beside her. They moved toward the west wing in silence for a moment, and she was running the sequence forward again, was checking it against what Moreland had given Harwick, and what Harwick would do with it, and where the next point of contact was. When she heard it. Boots. Not the soft, careful footsteps of palace staff, or the measured cadence of a patrol route. The hard, deliberate sound of men moving with a destination and a purpose, and not caring whether they were heard. She stopped. Odell stopped beside her. At the end of the corridor, at the junction where the central wing met the service wing access, 3 men in 2nd Division livery appeared. They were not running. They didn't need to run. They moved with the unhurried confidence of men who had been told that their target was in a corridor with limited exits and that the exits were already covered. In the middle of the 3 men, half a step back and wearing the expression of a man who had made his calculation and was living inside the result of it, was Captain Jess Moreland. He looked at her. She looked back at him. 19 years. 15 years of it, with this man at her back in various configurations of difficult circumstances. The marshes. The Eastern Campaign. The slow, grinding work of maintaining a kingdom's military integrity, while its political leadership made decisions she'd had to work around and sometimes absorb, and occasionally reverse. She had trusted him with the actual operational weight of her confidence. Not the performed version, not the strategic version. The real thing. He didn't look away from her gaze. She gave him credit for that. A smaller man would have found something else to look at. "My queen," he said, "Lord Harwick has requested your presence." The words were formal. The tone was formal. Everything about this moment was being conducted with the precision of men who had been told to do a thing correctly, which told her that Harwick was smart enough to understand that if this went wrong for him, the details of how it was conducted would matter. They were not going to touch her. They were not going to threaten her directly. They were going to escort her to Harwick and let the conversation with Harwick be the thing that determined what happened next. She assessed her position. The service corridor access was behind her, but Cray had told her the service corridors would be covered by the 5th bell, and the 5th bell had likely already passed. Morwen's chambers were behind her. Odell was beside her. She had the short blade, which was not a relevant variable against 3 armed men in a tight corridor unless she was willing to begin something violent, which she was not willing to do yet because she did not have enough pieces in position to survive what came after the violence. This was the moment. She could feel it in the way that she'd learned to feel the specific moments that bent things, that before and after were different weights. When the situation required something from her that was not strategy and not strength and not the forward motion she'd been built for. It required her to be taken somewhere, to walk into a room she hadn't chosen, at a time she hadn't chosen, in a position she hadn't designed. She had spent her entire life, all 42 years of it, never being in that position because she had always moved first, had always been the one setting the terms of the room, had stood in front of warlords and kings and the specific category of men who believed that a woman walking toward them in armor was a novelty rather than a threat. And she had always controlled the approach. Not now. "Lead the way," she said. Moreland held her gaze for one more second. She did not give him anything to read in hers. She had lived inside enough hard moments to know that the face you kept on the way to an interrogation was not a performance. It was a resource. Whatever was on her face right now was hers. Moreland didn't get it. She walked forward. They moved through the palace in the specific formation of a military escort that was technically an accompaniment. She was in the center, the 3 men flanking and trailing, Odell following 2 paces back because no one had told him to leave and he hadn't offered. The palace corridors at this hour were empty of anyone except the reassigned watch posts, and those men looked at her and looked away the way soldiers looked away from things they'd been told not to engage with. The War Council chamber was at the center of the palace, which was the point of it architecturally and politically. Equidistant from every wing, accessible from every direction. A room that had been designed to be the place where things were decided. She had been in it hundreds of times. She had sat in its chairs and stood at its maps and argued its decisions and implemented its outcomes for 19 years. The door was open. Harwick stood at the far end of the long council table. Not sitting, standing, which was a choice, a staging choice. Because a man who chose to stand in a room where the other person would have to enter and cross distance was a man who had decided where the power in the room was before the room was occupied. She entered and walked the length of the table and stopped 6 feet from him. He looked at her with the still gray eyes of a man who had spent 50 years being right about things and expected to continue. "My queen," he said. "Lord Harwick. I think it would be best if we talked plainly tonight." "Yes," she said. "Let's." He looked at her for a moment as though he'd been prepared for deflection and was recalibrating for the absence of it. "You've been moving through this palace tonight in a way that suggests you have information you're not meant to have." "I have information I found myself," she said, "which is a different thing. The letters from the East Wing are in my possession." He absorbed this without changing his expression. "The king can ask me for them in the morning when the full council is assembled." She held his gaze steadily. "I have no intention of discussing the letters in a room in the middle of the night with you." Harwick looked at her for a long, measuring moment. The room was very quiet. Behind her she could sense Moreland's presence, the specific weighted quality of a man who was trying to determine if what was unfolding in front of him was what he'd been told it would be. "You should understand the position you're in," Harwick said. "I understand my position precisely." "Then you understand that the king has the authority to—" "To what?" Her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It simply held the ground it occupied. "Complete a sentence, Lord Harwick. The king has the authority to what?" The silence after that was not comfortable for anyone in the room, and she was aware of this, and it was intentional. She had learned 20 years ago that the most destabilizing thing you could do in a room where someone was trying to establish authority was to refuse to receive the implicit pressure and instead make the thing explicit, force the words out into the air where they could be examined. Men who ran on implicit pressure hated being made explicit. Harwick's jaw was tight. "The king has the authority to act in the interests of the crown's stability." "So do I," she said. "I am the queen. For now." The two words hung in the air. She looked at him. She felt, in the very bottom of her chest, beneath the steadiness and the operational focus and the years of trained composure, something that was older than strategy. A cold, clarifying fury that was not reactive and not explosive, but was the kind of thing that settled in and changed the temperature of a person from the inside out. She had felt it before. In the marshes. In the moment when the retreat became a rout and she turned forward instead. It was not anger. It was the moment when a person stopped accommodating the world as it was and began preparing for the world as it was going to be. "For now," she said back to him very quietly. "Yes, for now." Behind her, she heard the War Council chamber's door open. She turned. Aldrich stood in the doorway. He was still in the formal clothes he'd worn to the banquet, which told her he hadn't slept. His face was composed with the specific effort of a man who had been told something difficult and had spent the last hour deciding how to present himself when he walked into this room. He looked at her. She looked at him. 19 years looked back at both of them from the distance between them, and it was a distance, she understood now, with complete and irreversible clarity that had not been created tonight. It had been there for a long time. She had simply been standing close enough that she couldn't see its shape. "Celine," he said, and she understood, in the way that she understood things when they were completely and finally true, that this was the last conversation they would have in which either of them could pretend the shape of what existed between them was anything other than what it actually was. She looked at the man who had taken 19 years of her life and built his reputation on her strategies and her blood and her absolute loyalty, and who had decided at some specific moment she would never be able to pinpoint that all of it was simply a resource to be managed until it became inconvenient. She had changed herself, 100 small ways, across 19 years to fit inside the space this life had required of her, had moderated the aggression, had measured the forward motion, had learned patience and diplomacy, and the particular stillness of a woman in a court that needed her to be queen more than it needed her to be a general. She was done with all of that now. She reached under her jacket and pulled the short blade and set it on the council table with a sound that rang through the quiet chamber like a struck bell. Not a threat, not a surrender, something else, a declaration. The declaration of a woman who had decided, in real time, to become something that this palace and this king and this court had spent 19 years trying to keep her from being. "All right," she said. "Let's talk." The blade on the council table caught the lamplight and held it. Nobody in the room moved for 3 full seconds. Not Harwick, not Morlin, not the 2nd Division men flanking the door, and not Aldrich, who was standing in the doorway with his formal jacket still on and his face carrying the careful composition of a man who had prepared for a version of this conversation that was not the version currently unfolding in front of him. Celine stood at the table with both hands flat on the surface, the short blade between them, and looked at her husband across 19 years of accumulated distance. "Close the door," she said. Nobody moved. "Close the door," she said again, and this time the register was in it. The voice she'd used on the eastern marshes when the line was breaking and the men needed a single sound to orient around. Morlin closed the door, not because she'd addressed him, and not because he was still on her side, but because that voice did not leave room for the alternative. Aldrich walked forward into the room. He stopped on the opposite side of the council table, 6 feet from the blade. He looked at it, and then at her face. "You found the letters," he said. 3 hours ago. "And the girl?" "Yes." He absorbed this with his jaw tight, and his eyes doing the specific calculation she'd watched them do 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. The calculation of damage against available response. The King's version of assessing a field position. She had sat beside this calculation for 19 years. She knew exactly what it looked like when it was running. "How much of what you found tonight have you already moved?" he said. She looked at him steadily. "All of it." The calculation shifted behind his eyes. "Where?" "Everywhere it needed to go." Harwick moved slightly at the far end of the table. She tracked the movement without looking at him, the way she'd always tracked peripheral motion in rooms. A skill that didn't switch off, had never switched off, had kept her alive in situations where the danger didn't announce itself from the front. "Lord Harwick," she said without turning, "if you move again without my acknowledgement, I will name you in the formal contest submission alongside Vale and Dunhart, and you will spend the next 14 days explaining your role in a treasury transfer that your signature appears on 3 times in the routing documents." Silence. Forrest had not confirmed Harwick's signature. She didn't know for certain it was there. But she had spent 19 years watching men react to accusations that were 80% certain, and the way Harwick went completely still told her the other 20% had just closed. Aldrich looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she hadn't expected. Not anger, not calculation. Something older. "Celine." "Don't," she said. "I need you to understand." "I understand everything," she said. "I understood it 3 hours ago when I read your letters. I understood it before that, actually. I understood it in the way that you understand things you don't want to understand. Slowly, over a long time, without ever letting yourself land on it directly." The room was very quiet. "You were going to exile me," she said. "Before the council session. You'd already committed the votes. You'd already moved the treasury assets. You'd already written the succession arrangement for a child that isn't born yet and didn't ask to be part of this." She kept her voice level. Every word at the same controlled pitch. "You were going to walk me out of this kingdom and hand it to an arrangement you'd made in secret, and you were going to do it in the council chamber in front of every lord who still respected what I'd built here." Aldrich said nothing. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Tell me when you decided. Not the logistics, not the letters. The moment you decided that 19 years of what we built together was a resource you could redistribute." He looked at her for a long moment. His face did something she hadn't seen it do in a long time. It stopped performing. Not honest exactly, but unperformed. 4 years ago, he said quietly, the Vale campaign review. When the generals presented the Eastern Marshes strategy and 3 of the council lords didn't know you'd written it. She said nothing. "I watched their faces," he said, "when they praised it and didn't know it was yours. And I thought," he stopped, started again. "I thought this kingdom will outlast both of us. And when it does, what's left is the name on the strategy, not the person who wrote it. So you made sure the name was yours." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer had been running for 4 years in the strategies credited to his generals and the campaigns reported as his victories and the formation that had broken the northern line this winter. She had given him all of it. Every instrument of her intelligence and her experience and the specific irreplaceable knowledge that 20 years of actual warfare had built in her body and her mind. She had given it freely because she had believed, had believed with the kind of certainty that you only built across 2 decades of shared difficulty, that what they were doing together was real. The fury she'd felt in the war chamber earlier had settled now into something colder and more useful. Not cold in the way of distance, cold in the way of a blade that had been properly tempered, harder for the cooling, capable of holding an edge that the untempered version couldn't hold. She picked up the short blade from the table and looked at Harwick. You have 2 choices. Walk out of this room and present yourself to Lord Morwin's chambers by the 6th bell for a formal witness statement, or stand here and become part of what happens next. She paused. I recommend the first option. Harwick looked at Aldrich. Aldrich said nothing. Harwick looked back at her. For a moment, the room held the specific weight of a man deciding which way a situation was going to fall. Then he walked to the door, opened it, and left. The 2 2nd Division men looked at each other and followed him, which told her that their loyalty had been to Harwick's authority rather than to the conspiracy itself, a distinction that would matter later. Morlin hadn't moved. She looked at him. He was standing at the side wall with his arms at his sides and the expression of a man who had made a choice that had not landed the way he'd projected it would, and was now doing the honest work of standing inside that. She had seen this expression on soldiers who had made tactical errors that cost people. She recognized it because it was real. Not performance, not calculation, actual reckoning. Go to Odell, she said. Tell him what you told Harwick, all of it, and tell him I sent you. Morlin looked at her for a long moment. Why? Because Odell will know what to do with it, and because I don't have time tonight to sort out what you are and what you aren't. She held his gaze. Go. He went. She and Aldrich were alone in the War Council chamber. He was still standing on the far side of the table. He hadn't moved since the others left, which meant he was either very controlled or he was genuinely uncertain what to do next, and she had never, in 19 years, seen him genuinely uncertain. She stood and looked at him and waited. The emergency session, he said finally. You know about it. 3 days? I have the votes. You had them 20 minutes ago. She watched his face. Contest filing goes to the council secretary before the 6th bell. Morwin, Casterly, Brath. 3 houses with clean standing. The calculation moved behind his eyes again, faster this time, assessing the names, running the implications. She watched it hit Brath, and watched his jaw tighten. Brath was the variable he hadn't planned for. Morwind and Casterly he might have managed. Braith changed the mathematics. 14 days, he said. 14 days. And then what? You think 14 days changes the vote count? I think 14 days is long enough for the full council to read 15 letters and 3 pages of Treasury documentation with the routing chain and see what you've done. She kept her voice level. I think noble houses that weren't part of your arrangement will read those documents and understand that what you've built here isn't a stable succession. It's a coup wearing formal clothes. It's governance. It's theft. The word landed in the room and sat there. Aldrich's expression shifted. The calculation dropped out of it, and something harder came up beneath it. Not anger, not quite, but the specific quality of a man who had been called something true in front of himself and was choosing whether to deflect it or absorb it. He absorbed it. What do you want? He said. Tonight, I want to walk out of this room with the letters and the documentation and the full freedom of this palace until the contest filing is confirmed. She paused. After that, I want an open council session with witnesses and every lord in this kingdom present to hear what the documentation says. And the girl. She looked at him. The girl is 20 years old and she's carrying a child in a room with a broken lock in your east wing, and she has no formal status and no protection, and whatever you told her she'd have, you were planning to give her exactly as much as was convenient and not one thing more. She let that settle. She's not your instrument. She's not mine either. She came to the palace willingly. People do things willingly when the alternative hasn't been explained to them yet. A long silence. You won't use the child against me, he said. That's not something you'd do. No, she said. I won't. The child is not part of this. She held his gaze. That's the difference between us tonight. He looked at her for a long moment with the unperformed face. The face underneath the king's face, the one she'd seen in the early years when there had still been the specific intimacy of 2 people building something together and the performance hadn't yet settled over all of it. She looked at it now and felt the weight of what it cost to recognize a person clearly, all the way to their actual shape, without the weight of what you'd wanted them to be distorting the view. He had been afraid of her for 4 years, not afraid of what she might do, afraid of what she was, afraid in the way that a person was afraid of something that reminded them of the distance between who they were and who they'd told themselves they were. She had been the measure he couldn't stop measuring himself against, and rather than rise to it, he had spent 4 years dismantling the measure. She understood it. She did not forgive it. "All right," he said. She walked to the door. "Celine." She stopped, didn't turn. "The Marshes campaign," he said, "but the 3rd month, when the eastern flank broke and you turned the whole formation forward instead of retreating." She waited. "I was watching from the command position," he said. "I had never seen anything like it in my life. I have never seen anything like it since." A pause. "I want you to know that I knew that day. I knew what you were." She stood with her hand on the door and breathed once, quietly, into the dark. "Yes, she said. "You did." She walked out. The palace at the near dawn hour had the specific quality of a place holding its breath. The night staff had completed their work. The morning staff hadn't yet arrived. The corridors were lit by low lamps at their intervals, the shadows between them deep enough to swallow a person whole. She moved through it toward the west wing and felt the exhaustion in her body for the first time. Not weakness, but the specific physical accounting that her body made after it had been running on focus and adrenaline for 6 hours. The acknowledgement that it had resources and had been spending them. She would sleep eventually. Not now. Petra was in her chamber awake, which Celine had expected. She was sitting in the chair by the window in the pre-dawn dark with the lamp down low and her hands in her lap. And when Celine entered, she looked up and did the assessment that 11 years had made instinctive and apparently found what she was looking for because she stood and crossed to the wardrobe without speaking and began laying out clean clothes. "The contest filing," Celine said. "Morwen sent his man 20 minutes ago. Casterly confirmed. Braith—" Petra paused. Braith sent back a single sentence. "He said he has been waiting for someone to ask him for 3 years." Celine sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the night pressed against the back of her neck, and the base of her spine and the specific point behind her eyes that had been tracking 12 separate things simultaneously for 6 hours. 3 years. Braith had been watching this for 3 years and waiting for someone to ask. She thought about all the people in this palace who had seen something wrong and measured the cost of saying so and chosen silence because no one else was speaking and the silence felt like the safer architecture. She thought about how a conspiracy held together, not by the strength of the conspirators, but by the silence of everyone who was watching and calculating and waiting for someone else to go first. She had gone first, not because she was brave, because she had run out of the particular option of being something that fit inside a structure that was dismantling her. She had stood in the war council chamber and set a blade on the table and told a room full of men what she was going to do. And 3 of them had walked out because the architecture they'd been standing in had shifted, and one of them had stayed because he was afraid of her. And the one who was afraid of her was the one who had spent 4 years afraid of her. Fear, she had learned, was not always the thing that ended you. Sometimes it was the signal that you had finally become exactly what the situation required. The 6th bell rang through the palace. She stood up. "The contest filing," she said. "Is it confirmed?" "It will be confirmed when the council secretary opens at 6 bells, Petra said. "Which is now." Which was now. She had 14 days. She was reaching for the clean clothes when the sound reached her. Not the 6th bell. Something underneath it, coming from outside the window. From the courtyard. She went to the window and looked down. The courtyard was lit by the early gray of approaching dawn, that specific flat light that made everything look like a preparatory sketch for the actual day. In the courtyard below, moving with the organized, purposeful efficiency of men who had been briefed and positioned and were now executing a plan, were soldiers. Not 2nd Division, not the Palace Guard. The royal crest on their chests was Aldrich's. They were moving toward the West Wing entrance. She looked at the count. 20, 25. Moving in the formation of men who had been given a retrieval order, not an attack order. Controlled, deliberate, no weapons drawn but hands close to hilts. The way soldiers moved when they'd been told there was a specific thing to collect, and they should collect it without incident if incident could be avoided. She turned from the window. "How long?" she said. Petra was already at the wardrobe. 3 minutes to the secondary exit, less if we move now. 3 minutes. Morwen needed 10 minutes to receive the contest filing confirmation. Casterly needed... Her mind ran the sequence and stopped at Odell. Odell had 43 men. Not stationed, not mobilized, available, as she'd described it to him in his office 6 hours ago. Available meant they were in their posts and in their beds and distributed across the palace in the ordinary configuration of the household guard's overnight positioning. 43 men who would respond to his word were not 43 men who were currently between the courtyard soldiers and the West Wing entrance. She looked back out the window. 27 soldiers. She counted them properly this time. 27, with 2 officers, moving in column. The officer in front was Reeve, 2nd Division. The officer behind was someone she didn't recognize at this distance. The order had come from the War Council chamber. After she had walked out, Aldrich had made one more decision. He had looked at the situation, the contest filing, the 14 days, the open council session she'd described, and he had decided that the 14 days were a problem he intended to solve before they began. She had walked out believing the conversation was over. It hadn't been over. She had made an error, not a large one, not one built from carelessness, but an error nonetheless. She had believed that the words she'd laid out in the War Council chamber constituted an agreement, that the man who had said all right had meant it the way she'd meant her words. She had applied her own standard of spoken commitment to a person who was currently proving that his standards were different. She would not make that error again. "Petra," her voice was even, "wake the household. All of it? Every person in this wing who has served me more than 2 years." She pulled on the clean jacket and reached for the sword. The real one, the campaign sword, the one that had been in her chamber because she'd set it down when she'd changed clothes 3 hours ago. She belted it correctly, checked the draw, moved on. "Tell them to come to the secondary corridor, not armed, present." She had 43 soldiers available and 3 minutes and 27 men moving toward an entrance. The mathematics of a direct confrontation were not in her favor in the next 3 minutes. But direct confrontation was not the only kind. She had spent 19 years in this palace. She had spent 6 hours tonight in its service corridors and its maintenance passages and its secondary exits and its hidden architectural logic. She knew this building the way she knew her own hands. Aldrich's men knew it the way men knew a place they'd been assigned to. She moved into the corridor. Odell was already there. She stared at him for a fraction of a second. He was in full uniform, jacket properly buttoned, the expression of a man who had not been sleeping because he had been anticipating exactly this. "How?" she said. "Morlin," he said, "he came to me like you told him to. He also told me that Aldrich had a second order drawn up before the conversation in the war chamber. Contingency. If the contest filing went through, the West Wing was to be secured before dawn." Morlin. She filed this differently than she had filed him an hour ago. 32 of my 1st Division are positioned in the east and central corridors right now, Odell said. Not between the courtyard soldiers and the entrance. I don't want a confrontation in the dark before the council secretary opens. But they're there. He paused. The other 11 are at the secondary exit, the service corridor access, and the maintenance passages. Nobody goes anywhere they haven't been told they can go. She looked at him. "You've been planning this since I left you the second time." "I've been planning this since the marshes," he said. "I just didn't know when it was going to be necessary." Down the corridor, the sound of the West Wing entrance doors being tested. Not forced, not yet, but the specific resonant sound of a heavy door being assessed by men who were deciding whether to knock or simply enter. She looked at Odell. He looked back. "My queen," he said, and his voice held something that had not been in it in any of their previous conversations tonight. Not deference, not duty, but the particular quality of a man who was choosing freely and wanted that to be understood. "What are your orders?" She thought about the eastern marshes. The moment the retreat became a rout and she'd turned forward. She thought about what it had cost to turn forward. Not the physical cost, not the battle cost, but the specific interior cost of being the person who looked at a situation where the safe direction was backward and chose the other one anyway. She thought about what kind of person could look at that cost clearly and still make the choice, and what that choice said about what they were willing to lose and what they weren't. She had nothing left to lose, not because everything had been taken, not yet, but because the process of the last 6 hours had stripped away the last remaining possibility that any part of the life she'd been living was what she'd believed it to be. The marriage, the crown, the carefully maintained architecture of who she'd become inside this palace, all of it was already gone. It had just taken tonight to make the goneness visible. A person who had nothing left to lose was not a person without resources. She had 43 soldiers and 11 positions, and the full architectural knowledge of a palace that had been her home for 19 years. She had 15 letters and 3 pages of treasury documentation. She had Morwind and Casterly and Brath and a filing that was being confirmed right now in the council secretary's office. She had everything she needed except the thing that had been making her hesitate, which was the belief that the man she'd married deserved a version of this that didn't end in total destruction. She had walked out of the war council chamber believing it. She didn't believe it anymore. "Hold the entrances," she said. "All of them. Nobody from the 2nd Division enters this wing without my direct authorization. If they push, hold." She paused. "I need 20 minutes. 20 minutes for what?" Odell said. "To get to the Grand Council chamber before Aldrich does." She looked at him steadily. "If I'm in that chamber when the council secretary opens, and if the lords are assembled, and if the documentation is in their hands before any emergency session order reaches them, there is no emergency session, there is no 3 days, there is no more waiting." Odell looked at her. "The session can't be called without a quorum." "Correct. You'd need 8 lords present, minimum, before the order arrives." "I have 8 lords staying in this palace tonight for the banquet." She paused. "Morwind, Casterly, Braith. Fenwick I can't use. Dunhart is compromised. But Aldous Rain arrived this afternoon. I saw his crest in the courtyard. Lady Mar has a standing chamber in the central wing. Lord Vassin came up from the southern province for the victory celebration and hasn't left yet." She looked at him. "That's 8. That's a quorum." From below, the west wing entrance doors opened. Not forced, opened. Someone on the inside had opened them. She heard Reeves' voice carrying up from the entrance hall, the formal, controlled tone of an officer executing an order, and she heard it interact with another voice, lower and steady, that she recognized as one of Odell's 1st Division men. Odell looked at her. 20 minutes, he said. "Go." She went. She moved through the palace with Petra 2 steps behind her and the sword at her hip and the specific, focused acceleration of a person who had finally stopped negotiating with the situation and was now simply moving through it at the pace the situation required. The central wing corridors were gray with approaching dawn, the lamps still lit but the light outside beginning to compete with them. The palace in the specific transitional state between night and morning where the rules of each applied and neither fully prevailed. She sent Petra ahead to Morwind's chambers with a single instruction. Bring him to the Grand Council chamber with whatever documentation Odell had distributed, now, regardless of what he was wearing. She sent Cray, found him at the service corridor junction, exactly where she'd known he'd be, to Casterly and Braith with the same message. She moved toward the council chamber. She was 30 seconds from the chamber entrance when she heard the footsteps behind her. Not a patrol, not soldiers. A single set of footsteps, quick and light, the sound of someone who had been moving fast and had been tracking her direction. She stopped and turned. Eveline stood in the corridor. Her hair was tied back now, which meant she had dressed deliberately, had made choices before coming here. She was wearing the silk robe over a plain dress, the one practical garment she apparently owned. She was slightly out of breath. She had navigated from the east wing to the central corridor on her own, which meant she had either found an unguarded route or had been let through by someone who recognized her. She held out a piece of paper. Celine took it, read it. It was short, 3 lines in a hand she didn't immediately recognize, and then at the bottom, unmistakably, Aldrich's signature. It was dated 2 nights ago. It was the formal succession document, the actual legal instrument signed and sealed, not the letters of arrangement and commitment she'd found in the East Wing. The actual document that named the unborn child as heir and set aside the current queen's claim. She looked at Eveline. "Where did you get this?" she said. "He kept it in the room," Eveline said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who had made a decision and was standing inside it. "He gave me the letters for safekeeping, but he kept this himself." He brought it 2 weeks ago and put it in the chest at the foot of the bed. She paused. I took it tonight when I heard the soldiers moving in the courtyard. Celine looked at the document, then at the young woman in front of her. You understand what this is, she said. I understand that he was never going to give me what he said. Evelyn's jaw was tight. I understand that this document exists and that it's signed, and that if it gets into the right hands tonight before anyone else has a chance to... She stopped. I'm not your enemy. I know. And I'm not his instrument. I know that too. Evelyn looked at her with the direct, clear-eyed look of a 20-year-old who had spent the last 6 hours sitting in a locked room with broken evidence and her own intelligence, and had arrived somewhere that the coaching hadn't prepared her for. What do I do? She said. Celine folded the document and put it inside her jacket, flat against her ribs beside Forrest's treasury pages, and looked down the corridor toward the Grand Council chamber entrance, which was 30 seconds away, and thought about what she was walking into and what she was carrying and what the next 20 minutes contained. She looked back at Evelyn. Stay behind me, she said, and don't speak unless I ask you to. She turned and walked the last 30 seconds to the Grand Council chamber entrance and pushed the doors open. The chamber was lit. All 12 lamps burning, which meant someone had been there before her. The long table was empty. The council secretary's podium at the far end was occupied. The secretary, a thin, precise man named Aldous Webb, who had held the position for 22 years, was standing behind it with the look of a man who had been woken in his chambers and escorted to his post and was managing the indignity with professional composure. And at the head of the table, in the chair that was designated for the senior lord in the absence of the crown, not the king's chair, not the queen's chair, but the formal position of council authority, sat Lord Braith. He was 70 years old and he was in full formal dress, which meant he had not been sleeping, which meant he had been ready. He looked at her when she entered. His eyes went to the woman behind her, then back to her face. My queen, he said, I believe you have something for the council to see. And down the corridor behind her, the sound of running footsteps, multiple, armed, the sound of men who had been given an order and were moving to execute it before a window closed, was getting louder. She pulled the documents from inside her jacket and laid them on the table. She looked at Braith. How many lords can you get in this room in the next 4 minutes? She said. He smiled. It was a small smile, the specific smile of a man who had been a student of patience for 3 decades and was watching something he'd been patient for arrive. I have been expecting this question for 3 years, he said. He raised his hand. Behind her, the chamber's secondary entrance, the one she hadn't come through, the one that opened from the central wing's administrative corridor, opened. And through it, in various states of formal dress, in the gray pre-dawn light of a morning that was about to change the shape of everything, the lords of the kingdom began to walk in. The running footsteps in the corridor outside were 30 seconds away. She set her hand flat on the documents and looked at the faces of the people assembling around the table and breathed once, slowly, into everything that was about to begin. The doors of the Grand Council chamber opened. Not the secondary entrance, not the administrative corridor. The main doors, the tall iron-hinged doors that had been closed when she entered, swung inward with the specific weight of doors being pushed by people who believed they had the authority to push them. Aldrich walked in first. Behind him came 4 soldiers in royal crest livery, and behind them, half a step back with the expression of a man who had realized the situation had advanced past the point where his particular contribution was still useful, Lord Castor Vale. And behind Vale, clearly summoned in haste and wearing the discomfort of a man who had been pulled from somewhere he'd preferred to stay, Lord Dunhart. Aldrich stopped when he saw the table. 7 lords already seated. Braith at the head. Morwind and Casterly flanking him. Rain, Mar, Vasson filling the remaining chairs with the specific posture of people who had been told something significant was happening and had decided, in the compressed time available, that they wanted to be present for it. The council secretary behind his podium with his hands folded and his face professionally blank. Odell standing at the side wall with 2 First Division soldiers who had entered through the administrative corridor's secondary access and who were not threatening anyone and were not being subtle about their presence. And Celine at the table's far end, with her hand flat on a stack of documents and the campaign sword at her hip, and the specific quality of stillness that the room had reorganized itself around. Aldrich looked at all of it. She watched him look at it, watched him assess the room the way she had assessed 1,000 rooms herself. Reading the positions, reading the faces, reading the space between what was visible and what it meant. She watched him land on Braith and hold there for a fraction of a second longer than anywhere else. And she watched his jaw tighten in the specific way of a man who had just confirmed the variable he'd failed to account for. "This session," he said, his voice carrying the king's register, controlled and authoritative, "has not been formally called." "This is not an emergency session," Braith said from the head of the table. His voice was unhurried, the voice of a man who had been in rooms like this for 50 years and knew exactly how much space his words occupied. "This is a quorum assembly for the review of documentation submitted under the Standing Council Charter. No royal authorization is required for a quorum assembly." He paused. "As you know." Aldrich looked at Braith for a long moment. "Lord Braith," he said, "I'd encourage you to consider the position you're placing yourself in." "I'm 70 years old," Braith said. "I have been considering positions for 50 years. I believe I have adequate practice." He looked at Celine. "My queen, you have the floor." She lifted the documents from the table. She had spent 20 years standing in front of rooms and making them listen to her. She had done it in battle councils and throne rooms, and the specific brutal, informal spaces where actual decisions were made, the spaces that didn't have official names because the people in them preferred it that way. She had learned how to speak to power and how to speak to fear and how to speak to the particular combination of intelligence and self-interest that drove most of the human decisions she'd ever witnessed. She spread Forrest's treasury documents on the table first. She narrated them plainly. Dates, amounts, routing chains, signatures. She did not editorialize. She did not escalate. She let the numbers speak in the flat, unambiguous language of financial documentation, which was the most persuasive language available to her because it was the one language in any room that could not be reinterpreted through the lens of loyalty or politics. Numbers were numbers. Signatures were signatures. She watched the lords' faces as they read along. Rain's eyes narrowed at the amount. Mara's expression went very still at Strand's countersignature. Vassan leaned forward. Then she laid the letters, not all 15. 8, selected for maximum clarity of the conspiratorial chain, Vaught's commitment, Dunhart's agreement, Fenwick's correspondence, and 4 of Aldrich's own letters in the sequence that showed the progression of the plan from early arrangement to finalized execution. She spread them in order across the table and let the assembled lords reach for them. Vale was standing near the main doors. He had not moved since Aldrich had stopped walking. He was looking at the letters on the table with the expression of a man watching something he had built being disassembled with his own components. Dunhart was looking at the floor. "And finally," she said, and reached inside her jacket and drew out the succession document, the formal legal instrument, signed and sealed, dated 2 nights ago, and placed it at the center of the table. The room went completely silent. Even the sounds of the palace outside, the morning staff beginning their work, the distant clatter of the kitchens waking, the ordinary ambient noise of a building coming alive, seemed to stop at the boundary of the chamber doors. Lord Ron picked up the succession document. Read it, set it back down, looked at Aldrich. "Your seal," he said, flat, factual. Aldrich said nothing. "Your signature," Ryan said. Still nothing. "On a succession instrument," Rain said, "that was not submitted to this council, was not reviewed by this council, and was drafted without the knowledge or consent of the Queen whose claim it supersedes." He paused. "While she was still in residence, while she was still performing the functions of the crown." The silence after that was the specific silence of a room in which something had been named that could not be unnamed. She watched Aldrich stand inside it, watched him hold his composure with the practiced ability of a man who had managed public moments for decades, who had learned the particular skill of not letting his face be the place where bad information landed visibly. She watched the composure hold, and then at some point she could not precisely identify, stop holding, not collapse, not crack dramatically, but simply cease to perform the way that a machine ceased to perform when the mechanism underneath it had finally worn through. He looked at her. "You would unmake everything we built," he said. His voice was quiet now. The King's Register was gone. What was underneath it was older and less managed. "You already unmade it," she said. "I'm just showing everyone what you built in its place." He held her gaze for a long moment. She held his, and she felt, in the space of that held gaze, the full weight of 19 years passing between them. Not warmly, not painfully, but with the specific gravity of things that had actually occurred. They had built something. It had been real, some of it. In the early years when the campaigns were raw and the kingdom was genuinely threatened, and they had stood together in the specific way of two people who needed each other to survive. She did not revise that out of existence. She held it clearly, the real parts and the corrupted parts simultaneously, without letting either one displace the other. That was the hardest thing she had done in a night full of hard things. Not the letters, not the treasury documents, not the confrontation in the War Council chamber. This, holding the truth of a thing clearly without the comfort of simplifying it. "Lord Braith," she said, without looking away from Aldrich, "I want the record to show that I am not requesting a punitive action against the Crown. I am requesting a formal council review of the documentation presented, a suspension of the emergency session order currently bearing the royal seal, and a full council vote on the succession instrument's validity." She paused. "To be conducted according to standing charter procedures, with all parties afforded the opportunity to speak." Braith looked at her for a moment. "That is an uncommonly measured request," he said, "from a woman standing in the position you're standing in." "I know what I'm asking for," she said. "I know what I'm not asking for." Braith nodded. He looked at the council secretary. "Record the submission, suspend the emergency order, convene full council within 48 hours. He looked around the table. "Seconded." "Seconded," Morwen said. "Seconded," Casterly said immediately after. The council secretary wrote, Aldrich stood at the far end of the chamber and watched his emergency order suspended and his succession document placed into formal evidence and the architecture of the thing he had built over 4 years of careful, patient, deliberate work entered into a review process that he had not designed and did not control. She watched him stand inside this and thought about what it cost a person to watch something they had invested in completely reach the end of its possibility. She had paid that cost tonight herself. She recognized it in him without sympathy and without cruelty. He looked, finally, at the soldiers behind him. They did not move. He looked at Vale. Vale was looking at the documents on the table. He looked at Dunhart. Dunhart had not raised his eyes from the floor since the succession document had been placed at the table's center. Aldrich stood alone in the middle of the Grand Council chamber and understood, in the specific way that understanding arrived when every alternative to it had been removed, that the room had already decided. Not against him, not yet, not formally. The votes hadn't been cast and the review hadn't been conducted. But the room had decided in the way that rooms decided before the formal process, in the quality of its silence, in the direction of its attention, in the way every face in it had oriented itself around the documents on the table, rather than around the king standing at its entrance. He had built his reign on being the person rooms oriented around. He was not that person tonight. He looked at her one final time. His expression held something she had not seen from him in many years, something without calculation underneath it, without the strategic layer that had been between him and the world for as long as she'd known him at his current depth. Something that might have been grief, or might have been the specific emotion that arrived when a person encountered the true cost of a decision they'd made and found it larger than they'd projected. She looked back at him and said nothing. There was nothing left to say that the room hadn't already said better. He turned and walked out. The soldiers followed. Vale followed without looking at anyone. Dunhart followed, still without raising his eyes. The doors closed behind them with the heavy resonance of old iron, and the chamber was quieter than it had been since the night began. The lords at the table exhaled in various ways. Rain set down the succession document. Mar folded her hands. Vassine leaned back in his chair. Braith sat very still at the table's head with the expression of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and had just been permitted to set it down. Celine stood at the far end of the table. She had been standing for 6 hours. She was aware of this in her body in a way she hadn't been until the immediate necessity of the last 10 minutes had passed, the specific ache of a person who had been running on decision and forward motion and had not stopped long enough to feel the accumulated weight of it. She felt it now. Felt it in the base of her spine and the backs of her knees and the particular exhaustion that lived behind the eyes and was distinct from tiredness and distinct from defeat. She was not defeated. She was simply done with the night. She looked at Odell, who was still standing at the side wall with the composed readiness of a man waiting for his next instruction. "Stand the first division down," she said. "Let the second division return to standard posts. Nobody is being held." She paused. "Make sure Harwick knows the council session is suspended and the watch reassignment order is nullified." "And Moreland," Odell said. She thought for a moment. "He answers to you," she said. "Handle it the way you'd handle any soldier who made a bad call in the field and then tried to correct it." She looked at him. "You've done that before." Odell nodded once. He left. Petra appeared at her elbow, had been somewhere in the room, probably the near-wall shadow, present and unobtrusive the way she always was. She put a cup of water on the table in front of Celine without speaking. Celine looked at it for a moment and then drank it. Braith rose from the table. The lords rose with him in the customary acknowledgement of the senior lord concluding an assembly. He looked at Celine across the length of the table. 48 hours, he said. "Full council. I'll have Webb send the summons." "Thank you, my lord." He looked at her with the direct, assessing look of a man who had spent 50 years evaluating the quality of people under pressure. "You showed considerable restraint tonight," he said, "more than the situation required." She considered this. "I showed what I could afford to show," she said. "Not more." He looked at her for another moment, then he walked out, and the other lords followed in the customary order, and the chamber emptied with the specific gradual quality of a room returning to itself after something significant had occupied it. She stood alone at the table. She was aware, in the silence, of everything the night had cost. Not politically. She could assess that later, in the daylight, with the full council 48 hours out, and the formal review process in motion. She would think about that later. What she was aware of now, in the quiet of the emptied chamber with the lamps burning and the succession document sitting at the table's center in a neat stack alongside the treasury pages and the letters, was the personal cost, the interior cost, the specific price of walking through 19 years of a life and arriving at its end with clear eyes and understanding exactly what it had been. She had loved him. She needed to hold this without revision. She had loved him genuinely in the early years, in the way that people loved when they were young enough, and the circumstances were hard enough, and the thing they were building together was real enough. That love had existed. The fact that he had used it as a resource, had drawn on it while building the thing that would eventually replace it, did not retroactively unmake it. It made it expensive. It did not make it false. This was the thing she was going to have to carry forward. Not bitterness, which was easy and available and ultimately corrosive in the way of things that felt productive and weren't. Not the simpler narrative of herself as purely wronged, which was available to her and would be believed by anyone who heard the story and would let her off the hook of the more complex truth. The more complex truth was that she had participated in this life, had made choices inside it, had moderated herself to fit inside structures that hadn't deserved her moderation, had given away parts of herself. The general's directness, the warrior's forward motion, the specific undiluted quality of her own intelligence, in the service of a marriage and a court that had needed her to be smaller than she was. She had done that. Not because she was weak, because she had believed the exchange was worth it, because she had believed, across 19 years of accumulating evidence that should have revised the belief, that what she was trading away was going toward something real. She had been wrong about that. The cost of being wrong about that was sitting in her body right now, in the exhaustion and the specific interior weight of a person who had spent the night walking through the ruins of a long investment and was going to have to decide in the daylight what to build next. She didn't know yet what that was. That was new. She had always known what the next thing was, had always been pointed at something, driven toward something, operating inside the forward motion that was her fundamental nature. Not knowing was a different country. She was standing at its border in the early morning light coming through the council chamber's east window, and she was finding, to her own surprise, that it did not frighten her. She picked up the succession document from the table and looked at it one more time. Then she set it back down for the council secretary to file. She walked out of the grand council chamber. The palace was fully awake now. Morning staff in the corridors, the smell of the kitchens operating, the ambient sound of a building resuming its ordinary rhythms after the disruption of the night. People looked at her when she passed and looked away, doing the particular thing that palace staff did when they had caught the edges of a significant event and were managing the knowledge that they had caught it. She walked through it at her own pace, not rushed, not performing anything. She went to the east wing. The door to Evelyn's room was still open. She'd broken the lock, and it had stayed open through the night. Evelyn was inside, sitting on the bed, not in the silk robe anymore, but in a plain dress with a travel bag on the floor beside her feet. She looked up when Celine appeared in the doorway. She had been crying. Not recently. The evidence was dried. She had been crying at some point in the night, and had stopped and had been sitting with the aftermath of it, which was a different thing and required different treatment. Celine stood in the doorway for a moment, and then walked in and sat in the chair across from the bed. The same chair she'd sat in hours ago. The candle on the window ledge had burned down to nothing. They looked at each other. "Is it over?" Evelyn said. "The worst of it," Celine said. "There's a formal council review in 48 hours. After that—" She stopped. "After that, there are processes. They take time. Nothing will be decided quickly." "What happens to me?" Celine looked at her. The young woman's hands were folded over her stomach in the unconscious way of a person who was aware of a presence that others couldn't see yet. She was 20 years old. She had come to this palace in the belief that she was entering something that was being offered to her, and she was learning what it actually was in the specific brutal way of things you learned by being inside them. "You have options," Celine said. "You don't have to stay here. You don't have to be part of whatever the council decides about the formal arrangements." She paused. "The child will be provided for regardless of what happens with the succession question. I'll make sure of that before the review." Evelyn looked at her. "Why?" "Because the child is real and didn't choose any of this." "That's not what I'm asking." Evelyn's voice was quiet. "Why does it matter to you what happens to me and the child? You have every reason to—" "I'm not interested in the reasons I have to do the other thing," Celine said. "I've had enough of this palace running on that logic." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then, "I want to go home," she said. It came out smaller than her voice had been all night, smaller and more honest. "I want to go back to the Dunhart estate and have this baby somewhere that isn't a palace corridor." "Then that's what you'll do." "My father—" "Your father made his choices. You made yours." Celine held her gaze. "They're not the same choices. You don't inherit his accounting." Evelyn looked at her for a long moment with the clear-eyed look she'd had since the middle of the night, when the coaching had stopped running and her own intelligence had taken over. "You're not what he said you were." Celine almost smiled. "What did he say I was?" "Cold. Finished." A pause. "He said you had been great once, and the greatness was behind you, that you were running on the memory of it. And you walked through a broken door in the middle of the night and took apart everything he'd built in 6 hours." Evelyn looked at her hands. "I don't think the greatness was behind you." Celine sat with that for a moment. It was a kind thing to say, and it was true, which was a rarer combination than it should have been. She felt its weight without deflecting it, and without drawing it out into something larger than it was. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll have Petra arrange an escort to the Dunhart estate tomorrow. Nothing official, just safe." She stood up. "Queen Celine." Evelyn's voice stopped her at the door. She turned. "I'm sorry," the girl said. "For my part in it, I'm sorry." She looked at Evelyn for a long moment. The apology was genuine. She could tell, had always been able to tell, had spent 42 years reading the difference between performed contrition and actual reckoning. This was actual reckoning. The young woman was sitting on the edge of a bed with a travel bag at her feet, and the evidence of a night's worth of grief on her face, taking responsibility for her portion of a situation that had been larger and older and more deliberate than she'd known when she'd walked into it. "I know," Celine said. "Get some sleep." She walked back to the West Wing. Petra was in the chamber, which she'd expected. She had drawn the curtains against the morning light, which she'd also expected. Petra knew her well enough to know that what she needed after a night like this was not brightness. She had set out clean clothes and a basin of water and a small plate of food from the kitchen, and she was standing at the side table with the patient presence of a woman who had decided that her job right now was simply to exist in the room and be available. Celine set the campaign sword on its rack. She took off the riding jacket and washed her face and hands in the basin and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, longer than she usually looked, longer than function required. She was looking at the 42-year-old face of a woman who had spent the night doing the hardest things she'd ever done and had come through them not unscathed but intact. The specific distinction between those two conditions was not a small one. She looked at the lines that weren't there at 23, the specific set of the jaw that had come from years of holding things that needed holding, the eyes that were the same eyes she'd always had, and had simply accumulated more behind them. She looked at all of it without judgment and without the specific critical accounting that women were trained in every culture she'd ever moved through to apply to their own faces. She had earned this face. "Petra," she said. "My queen, after the council review, however it goes, I'll need to make some decisions about what comes next." She paused. "I'm not going to make them tonight." "No," Petra said. "Tonight you sleep." She ate the food on the plate, which she needed, and she lay down on the bed in the clean clothes, which was not how she usually slept, but was how she was going to sleep today. Petra drew the last curtain, and the room went dim and quiet. The sounds of the palace morning present but distant. The world outside continuing its ordinary business while she lay still inside it. She thought, in the space before sleep arrived, about the marshes, about the formation turning forward, about the specific moment when forward and backward were both bad options, and forward was the one that had a direction. She thought about what Aldrich had said in the War Council chamber, that he had known, that day in the marshes, what she was, that watching her had been the thing that had eventually made him afraid. She had spent 19 years being smaller than she was, so that the thing he'd seen in the marshes wouldn't frighten him further. Had spent 19 years moderating and accommodating and adjusting, and the adjustment had not prevented the fear. It had simply deferred it while costing her in the meanwhile. The fear had arrived anyway, had arrived and produced exactly what fear produced in a certain kind of person, which was a preemptive strike in the direction of the thing that frightened them. She was done adjusting, not because adjusting was wrong, not because accommodation was weakness, because there was a version of adjusting that came from genuine partnership and a version that came from the appeasement of someone else's fear, and she had spent 19 years doing the second while believing it was the first, and she could see the difference clearly now, and she was not going to mistake them again. Whatever came after the council review, throne or no throne, palace or open road, the continuation of a public life, or the beginning of something entirely different, she was going to be exactly what she was inside it. The general's directness, the warrior's forward motion, the full, undiluted quality of her own intelligence operating at the speed it was capable of operating. She was going to stop apologizing in the quiet interior way she'd been apologizing for years, for the specific texture of what she was. This was not arrogance. It was the particular liberty that arrived on the other side of loss, the freedom that became available when you'd paid the full price of something and held nothing back and come through.